Hello friends, and welcome back to Medieval Historian. In today's video, we're diving into one of the darkest and most terrifying chapters of medieval history, the Inquisition. This wasn't a crusade fought with armies, but with whispered accusations, secret tribunals, and instruments of torture. We'll uncover how the Church used fear as a weapon, branding heretics, forcing confessions, and executing those who dared to believe differently. It's a story of power, faith, and suffering, where saving a soul often meant breaking a body. Now, in our modern world, we take for granted the freedom to speak our minds, follow different beliefs, or question authority without fear of punishment. But in medieval Europe, doing any of that could get you imprisoned, tortured, or worse, burned at the stake. Today, people debate ideas online, argue over facts, and challenge tradition. Back then, a single word against doctrine could mean death. The Inquisition was a system built to control, not to understand, and its legacy still casts a long shadow. So, before we begin and before you get too comfortable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? I'm just a nerd who loves digging into history's darkest corners, and it always blows my mind to see people tuning in from all over the world. Let's begin. This is the dark side of the Medieval Inquisition. To understand the Inquisition is to uncover a dark mechanism built within the framework of religion designed not to heal the soul, but to dominate it. The Inquisition was not a single event, but a system, a machinery of power established by the medieval Catholic Church to suppress heresy. It functioned as a tribunal, a court of faith, wielding spiritual authority with terrifying efficiency. At its core, it was an institution designed to identify, examine, and punish those who held beliefs contrary to official church doctrine: heretics, dissenters, outsiders. Anyone who strayed from the orthodoxy risked being labeled, judged, and condemned. The word Inquisition itself comes from the Latin inquirere, meaning to seek, but what it sought was conformity, control, and confession, not justice. The earliest forms of inquisitorial action appeared as early as the 12th century, during a time when Europe was both spiritually and politically fragile. The rise of movements such as the Cathars and the Waldensians Christians who challenged the authority or practices of the Church sparked anxiety within ecclesiastical leadership. These groups were not mere theological debates. They were seen as threats to the divine order and, more importantly, to the Church's influence over society. Heresy, then, was treated not just as spiritual error, but as treason. If God's kingdom was unified under Rome, then deviation wasn't simply disagreement, it was rebellion. It had to be rooted out by any means necessary. What made the Inquisition so effective and so feared was its blend of spiritual purpose and legal process. The Church sanctioned it, but it was executed with cold, procedural precision. Inquisitors, often members of the Dominican order, were appointed by the Pope to act as arbiters of faith. They were not there to debate, they were there to determine guilt. Trials were not fair by modern standards. The accused were often denied legal counsel. Charges could be anonymous. A neighbor's suspicion or a whispered rumor might be all it took. And if you thought silence would protect you, think again. Refusing to confess or cooperate could be seen as proof of guilt. The Inquisition was not limited to one region or one century. Its methods and reach evolved, stretching across France, Italy, Spain, and beyond. In some places, it focused on eradicating heretical Christians. In others, like Spain, it targeted converted Jews and Muslims, those suspected of practicing their old faiths in secret. It adapted itself to political agendas, local fears, and broader church goals. It was not one body, but many heads of the same beast. Perhaps most chilling is how the Inquisition operated under the belief that it was saving souls. To confess, even under torture, was to open a path to forgiveness. Punishment was a form of purification. And if the body had to suffer to save the soul, then so be it. It's this paradox violence committed in the name of mercy that makes the Inquisition not only historically significant, but profoundly disturbing. By the time it became formalized under papal authority in the 13th century, the Inquisition had become something else entirely, a system where confession was coerced, truth was optional, and terror was divine. Fear, not faith, was the true spark that lit the fires of the Inquisition. By the 12th century, Europe was emerging from the Dark Ages into a new phase of growth and instability. Towns were expanding, knowledge was spreading, and voices once buried by the weight of tradition began to rise. But not all voices echoed the authority of Rome. Heresy's alternative spiritual movements began gaining traction, and for church leaders already nervous about their waning grip on society, this was more than a theological problem. It was a crisis of control. And fear, when paired with power, rarely leads to mercy. The church was terrified, not just of doctrinal error, but of fragmentation. Heresies like the Cathars taught that the material world was evil, that the church was corrupt, and that salvation lay elsewhere. The Waldensians dared to preach outside of church authority. These movements didn't just interpret Christianity differently, they directly challenged the structure that gave the church its earthly power. And so, fear gave way to action. The papacy realized it could not allow such voices to grow unchecked. If heresy spread, then so would disobedience. And with disobedience came the possibility of revolution. What made this period so volatile was how fear seeped into every corner of society. It wasn't just clergy who were concerned, it was rulers, nobles, and commoners. If the church fell into disarray, what would become of divine order? The idea that heaven and earth were mirrored in the church's hierarchy meant that any threat to spiritual authority could ripple into political and social chaos. The church portrayed heresy not only as a sin but as a disease, one that could infect whole communities. Like a plague, it had to be stopped at the source. And so, the Inquisition was born out of panic. At first, inquisitorial practices where informal local bishops might investigate and punish suspected heretics. But their efforts were inconsistent, often too lenient for the tastes of the higher clergy. By the time Pope Innocent III came to power, a new model was needed. He launched a crucidenat against foreign lands, but against fellow Christians. The Albigensian Crusade, aimed at exterminating the Cathars in southern France, was one of the earliest and bloodiest examples of this fear turned to violence. Entire towns were wiped out. The phrase, "Kill them all, God will know his own," was reportedly spoken during one such massacre. It was a holy war, and it set the tone for what would follow. Fear shaped the Inquisition's methods. Trials were conducted in secrecy. Witnesses could remain anonymous. Confessions were prized above all, even if extracted under extreme duress. People began to fear each other, not knowing who might denounce them. Whole communities became quiet, paranoid, subdued. In this climate, the Inquisition didn't need armies to control people. It had terror. This was not about restoring truth, it was about restoring dominance. The church feared it would lose its grip, so it tightened its hand. And in doing so, it unleashed centuries of suffering cloaked in the name of spiritual purity. What began as fear of a changing world became a justification for persecution, punishment, and control. In the heart of medieval Europe, power and salvation were inseparable, and the church stood at the center of both. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, cracks had begun to form in its once unshakable authority. These were not the loud cracks of war or open rebellion, but quieter ones, questions whispered in towns, doubts murmured in homes, and sermons delivered in hidden gatherings. The church was no longer the only voice speaking about God, and that frightened those who had long claimed divine monopoly over truth. Literacy was spreading, slowly but surely. Townspeople began to hear alternative teachings, often from traveling preachers unaffiliated with Rome. Some teachings were simple calls for reform, urging the clergy to live modestly, to serve rather than rule. Others, like the Cathars, rejected the material world entirely, believing the physical was evil and corrupt, a direct insult to a church growing ever more wealthy and politically entangled. The church owned vast lands, taxed heavily, and lived in visible luxury. That contrast between spiritual doctrine and material practice didn't go unnoticed. People asked why the clergy wore gold while preaching poverty, or why sins could be forgiven for the right price. The church didn't just see these doubts as misguided, they saw them as dangerous. Questioning the church wasn't just a matter of theological disagreement, it was painted as an existential threat to spiritual order. The Pope wasn't simply a religious figure, he was considered God's representative on earth. To question the church was to question divine authority. As these doubts gained momentum, the papacy responded not with reflection or humility, but with enforcement. The Inquisition became the Church's most powerful answer to dissent, transforming spiritual doubt into legal offense. This wasn't about correcting the faithful, it was about silencing the doubtful. The Church was not blind to its growing vulnerability. It knew that the more voices that challenged it, the harder it would be to maintain centralized control over increasingly diverse and restless Christian communities. This anxiety explains why the Inquisition targeted not just prominent heretical leaders, but also everyday people, artisans, widows, farmers, even children. The idea was simple: eliminate heresy at the root by erasing any trace of doubt. Entire towns were questioned, families torn apart. Sometimes, the mere association with someone accused was enough to be summoned. Authority wasn't just asserted, it was performed, and the spectacle of trials, forced confessions, and public penance served as grim theater to remind the masses who ruled both soul and body. There were those within the church who quietly sympathized with reformers. Some priests lived humbly and genuinely sought to follow Christ's example. But in a system built on hierarchy, dissent even from within was met with suspicion. Unity was demanded, silence was safety, and questioning, even if rooted in truth, became a dangerous gamble. Thus, what began as calls for reform devolved into a standoff between conscience and power. The Church chose to double down on control rather than open itself to critique. Its fear of being weakened led it to become more brutal. Rather than guiding the flock, it hunted the wayward. In this climate, the Inquisition wasn't a tragic misstep. It was a logical extension of a system that equated loyalty with salvation and inquiry with treason. The rise of heresy in medieval Europe didn't come from outsiders, it rose from within. It wasn't imported by enemies, but born from the faithful who dared to reimagine what it meant to follow Christ. Heresy was not simply rebellion, it was conviction. For many, it was a return to what they believed was the true spirit of Christianity, stripped of church pomp and privilege. In this sense, the heretics were not godless, far from it. They were deeply spiritual, but their faith took a form that Rome could not tolerate. The Cathars are perhaps the most infamous example. Flourishing in southern France during the 12th century, they taught a radical dualism, that the physical world was created by an evil force, and only the spiritual realm was good. They rejected material wealth, church sacraments, and even marriage. To them, the church was part of the corrupt material world, and they saw no salvation in its rites or rituals. The Cathars lived simply, preached equality, and attracted a large following, especially among those disillusioned by the lavishness and political entanglements of the Roman Church. To many poor and rural Europeans, the Cathars offered a purer, more accessible path to God. Alongside them were the Waldensians, followers of Peter Waldo, who preached in the streets, translated scripture into local languages, and lived in poverty. They believed every believer had the right to read the Bible and speak openly about faith ideas we might find ordinary today, but were revolutionary, even criminal, in their time. The Church maintained that only trained clergy could interpret sacred texts, and to claim otherwise was to challenge its very legitimacy. These heretical movements didn't just teach different beliefs, they built communities, created networks, and spread ideas. In an age before printing presses, word of mouth and traveling preachers were powerful tools. The Church recognized this threat not just in spiritual terms, but in logistical ones. Heresy spread like fire through the dry fields of European discontent. The Inquisition became the bucket of water, and sometimes the flame meant to scorch the earth entirely. To understand the threat heresy posed, one must consider the Church's worldview. It saw itself as the singular path to salvation. Any deviation was not merely wrong but dangerous to eternal souls. To the faithful, heretics endangered the community, and to Church officials, they undermined centuries of tradition and authority. Heresy, in the Church's view, wasn't a private belief, it was a public toxin, and so the fight against it was not theological, it was survival. But for many of the accused, heresy was not a crime but a calling. These were not people cloaked in rebellion. They were farmers, mothers, poets, preachers. Their faith was their crime. And as their voices grew louder, the Church responded not with dialogue, but with suppression. The Inquisition wasn't a tool of persuasion, it was a hammer designed to crush. Pope Innocent III did not just inherit the papacy, transformed it into a force that reached beyond altars and monasteries, into the very bones of European society. His reign from 1198 to 1216 marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of the medieval Church, a moment when spiritual leadership merged decisively with political authority. He believed deeply that the Pope stood between God and man, a mediator who held the keys not just to heaven, but to order on earth. And with that belief, he set out to solidify Church power across every corner of Christian Europe, especially by crushing heresy. Under Innocent's leadership, the Church would no longer simply preach against dissent, it would mobilize armies. When reports of the Cathar heresy spreading through the Languedoc region reached Rome, Innocent responded not with debate, but with war. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209, was a military campaign against fellow Christians, sanctioned with the same fervor as any holy war against non-believers. Knights were promised spiritual rewards for slaughtering entire villages accused of harboring heretics. It was a turning point where the line between religious doctrine and brutal enforcement was erased. Innocent III's view of heresy was absolute. It was not to be tolerated, reasoned with, or examined, it was to be eliminated. And to accomplish that, he needed tools more precise than armies. He needed a system that could identify, isolate, and punish heretics systematically. Thus began the ideological groundwork for the Papal Inquisition. Bishops had already conducted informal inquisitions for decades, but these efforts were disorganized and inconsistent. Innocent began to centralize and formalize these processes, empowering the clergy to act not just as spiritual guides, but as judicial authorities with the power to judge, sentence, and punish. This shift represented more than religious zealot, was institutional engineering. Innocent's Church was becoming a state within states, capable of levying punishments independent of kings and nobles. In some cases, it even challenged secular rulers directly, asserting the supremacy of the Church over all earthly power. He convened the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which reinforced the Church's duty to root out heresy and demanded that secular authorities assist in its eradication. Any ruler who failed to act could be excommunicated and removed. The terrifying beauty of Innocent's vision lay in its structure. It wasn't a chaotic witch hunt, it was a framework, a doctrine of control. He legitimized the concept of religious investigation as a sacred duty, embedding it into canon law and setting the stage for centuries of inquisitorial expansion. With him, the seeds of a system were sown that would eventually become a sprawling network of tribunals across Europe and even the New World. Though Innocent III did not live to see the full realization of the Inquisition, his policies, decrees, and unwavering stance against dissent laid its foundation. He transformed fear into doctrine, suspicion into law, and authority into an instrument of divine punishment. Under his hand, the Church was no longer just a spiritual institution, it was an engine of discipline with eternal consequences. The official birth of the Papal Inquisition came not in a thunderous moment of proclamation, but in a slow, methodical progression of control. It followed the bloodshed of the Albigensian Crusade, which had shown that military force alone could not eliminate heresy. Heretical ideas were not confined to a battlefield, they moved through towns, whispered in homes, hidden in books and sermons. To combat this invisible enemy, the Church needed a different kind of weapon rooted in surveillance, investigation, and fear. Thus emerged the Papal Inquisition, a formal institution designed to seek out heresy wherever it might hide. By the 1230s, Pope Gregory IX took the framework left by Innocent III and gave it structure. He issued a series of bulls that established inquisitors as representatives of the papal officemen who held authority directly from the Pope to identify and try heretics. These inquisitors were usually drawn from the Dominican order, a new group of friars known for their scholarship and zeal. Unlike bishops, who had to juggle political and administrative duties, the Dominicans could focus entirely on rooting out dissent. They traveled from town to town, armed not with swords, but with questions. The inquisitors' approach was precise. They would arrive in a region, announce a grace period in which heretics could confess voluntarily, and then begin the real work. Witnesses were summoned, accusations collected, and suspects interrogated. Everything was recorded meticulously. It was the Church's own shadow legal system, operating independently of local rulers, but often with their support. The process was shrouded in secrecy. Defendants rarely knew who had accused them. Defense was difficult. Outcomes were often preordained. What made the Papal Inquisition distinct was its scale and endurance. It became a machine, replicable across borders. It did not need armies or castles, it needed silence, cooperation, and fear. Records were kept, techniques refined, punishments standardized. This was not about a wild, sporadic purge, it was a cold bureaucracy of belief, and like any bureaucracy, it expanded. Inquisitors did not just punish, they educated. They gave sermons after trials to explain why the condemned had to be corrected. They told crowds that heresy was like poison in the soul, and their work was that of healing, even if that healing involved pain. The terrifying part was that they believed it. Inquisitors were often true believers, convinced that they were saving lives by forcing confessions and issuing punishments. To them, burning a body was worth it if it saved a soul. The birth of the Papal Inquisition was not merely a reaction to heresy, it was a statement of dominance. It declared that truth belonged to the Church, and all who deviated from it must be found and corrected. Whether through gentle coercion or brutal enforcement, the Inquisition became the arm of divine law. It was not a fringe movement, it was the official voice of orthodoxy. By the mid-13th century, the Inquisition had entrenched itself deeply into European life. Its courts operated in secrecy, its judgments were feared, and its presence loomed large. And though it claimed to offer redemption, it often delivered something far more permanent: submission. The Inquisition wasn't just a force of ideology, it was a structure built from tools, processes, and tactics designed to control and terrify. At its heart was the inquisitorial tribunal, a court unlike any in modern law. It had no jury, no transparency, and little mercy. The inquisitors acted as investigator, prosecutor, and judge. Their authority flowed directly from the papacy, and their procedures followed a strict logicon that prioritized confessions above evidence and conformity above justice. When an inquisitor entered a town, the community held its breath. The process began with a public declaration, a period of grace during which heretics could come forward voluntarily and confess. Doing so might spare them the harshest punishments, but even the penitent were marked. Their names entered the record. They were monitored, their reputations tainted. For those who remained silent or were accused by others, the tribunal began in full. Suspects were summoned, often without knowing the nature of the charges or the names of their accusers. Witnesses could remain anonymous, and multiple accusations, no matter how flimsy, were enough to initiate formal interrogation. The goal was not to discover innocence or guilt, but to extract admission. Truth, in this system, was equated with confession. The tribunal's questioning methods were exacting and relentless. Inquisitors used detailed manuals that offered step-by-step guidance on how to break down a suspect's resistance. They asked theological riddles designed to confuse. They interrogated over days, pushing deeper into a person's beliefs, intentions, and associations. Silence could be taken as defiance, evasion as guilt, denial as proof. And then came the instruments. Though not all inquisitions used physical coercion, many did. In some regions, torture was authorized to compel confession, but only under strict conditions, at least in theory. In practice, these restrictions were elastic. The rack, the strappado, and other medieval devices were not used for punishment, but for persuasion. The pain inflicted wasn't for revenge. It was meant to break the will, to make the soul speak what the church needed to hear. Confession was the ultimate goal. A confession, even extracted under duress, allowed the tribunal to claim success. It saved the soul. Once a person admitted guilt, they might be required to perform penance, public humiliation, wearing special garments, pilgrimage, or in more severe cases, imprisonment. But those who refused, those who recanted, they faced harsher consequences, sometimes even death, often executed by secular authorities at the church's direction. But the tools extended beyond the courtroom. Inquisitors kept meticulous records. Every trial, testimony, and punishment was documented. These archives became vast repositories of fear names that could resurface years later, families forever marked by suspicion. Guilt, in the eyes of the Inquisition, was rarely forgotten. The tribunal system was a machine quiet, legalistic, and merciless. It masked its violence in procedures and its fear in piety. People learned to police themselves, to whisper their doubts in private if at all. Communities fractured under the weight of suspicion. And while the church claimed this machinery was built to protect truth, for those who lived under its shadow, it felt more like a cage. In the eyes of the Inquisition, confession was a sacred act, but how that confession was obtained often revealed more about power than faith. Torture, though officially regulated and only used when necessary, became a silent partner in the quest for spiritual conformity, and while it was cloaked in the language of salvation, its true function was fear. For many, it wasn't the fire that broke the mitt, was the slow grinding of their will through devices designed not to kill, but to convince. The use of torture was not immediate. It came only after other forms of questioning had failed, at least officially. But inquisitors were trained to look for signs of resistance, and resistance itself was often seen as guilt. If a suspect maintained innocence too strongly, or if their story seemed too practiced, they could be moved to what was euphemistically called the question. Once authorized, the process unfolded with clinical precision. The church never drew blood or directly executed, but it allowed others to do so in its stead, and often the line between permission and denial was thin. Devices varied by region, but several became infamous. The rack stretched the body until joints threatened to tear. The strappado hoisted a person into the air by bound arms before dropping them suddenly, wrenching shoulders. Other tools were simpler tight bindings, crushing weights, enforced stress positions. The pain was not meant to destroy, but to dismantle resistance. Inquisitors watched for signs of breaking sobs, tears, trembling words that gave way to full confessions. And yet, even under such duress, some refused. These were seen as dangerous souls, unreachable, unrepentant, often executed or imprisoned for life. But most broke. Not because they were guilty, but because they were human. Confessions extracted under torture were rarely reliable, yet they were accepted without question. The Church argued that even under pain, the soul could still speak truth. It ignored the desperation behind those words. The most chilling aspect of this system was its self-reinforcement. Once a confession was made, it validated the method. It proved the system worked, and so the use of torture continued not as a failure of justice, but as an instrument of faith. This was not rogue violence. It was institutionalized, approved, written into the process, and it created a culture of silence. People feared being named. They feared the interrogation room, the tools, the outcome. There were guideliness-opposed limitations. Torture could not be repeated unless new evidence appeared. It could not draw blood. It could not be lethal. But these rules were elastic. Inquisitors bent them. Secular officials sometimes did the rest. The suffering of the body was considered acceptable if it brought salvation to the soul. Over time, the practice was defended by theologians, justified by legal scholars, and accepted by the church hierarchy. The moral weight was dismissed under the banner of eternal consequence. Better a soul suffer now than burn forever. It was this logic, chilling and absolute, that turned the Inquisition's chambers into places not just of judgment, but of quiet, sanctioned torment. Confession, once obtained, was not the end. For many who survived the tribunal, the sentence that followed would haunt them far longer than the trial itself. The Inquisition didn't always seek to execute. More often, it sought to make examples living reminders of what awaited those who strayed from the orthodoxy. The guilty were sent back into their communities, not as freed souls, but as marked ones. And their punishment was not hidden. It was public, intentional, humiliating. Public penitence was a spectacle. Those sentenced were forced to wear special garments, most famously the San Benito, a yellow tunic painted with crosses or symbols representing the heresy committed. Some bore images of flames or demons. Others had inscriptions naming their crime. These were not decorations, they were visual warnings. The penitent became walking sermons. They would often be paraded through the streets, heads shaved, sometimes barefoot, while townspeople watched in silence or whispered judgment. The purpose was twofold: shame the guilty and terrify the innocent. Penance could take many forms. Some were sentenced to wear the San Benito for life. Others were ordered to fast for months, make long pilgrimages, or live in isolation. More symbolic punishments included public whippings or forced attendance at sermons where their sins were listed aloud. Even after completing their penance, their names were kept in the inquisitorial records, and suspicion lingered. A person once accused was never truly free. Entire communities adjusted their behavior. People avoided former heretics, fearing association. Businesses refused them service. Marriages broke down. Children were stigmatized. The Inquisition didn't need to surveil every village personally. Its punishments created environments where society policed itself. Fear became communal. In some cases, the punishment wasn't only for those convicted, but also for their corpses. If a person died during the trial or had evaded arrest for years, their remains might be dug up and burned, their property seized. Families were made to watch as ancestral graves were desecrated. It wasn't just the body that was punished, was memory, lineage, legacy. To be a heretic was to risk erasure, not just of self, but of all that connected you to the world. What made public penance so effective was its visibility. It served as a living deterrent. The humiliation lasted longer than the trial, and it fed the myth of justice. To outsiders, these rituals gave the appearance of redemption, of mercy. After all, they were not executed, but the psychological scars of being branded a threat to God never healed. People changed how they spoke, how they prayed, how they behaved in public. The Church insisted this was a path to salvation. They claimed that public penance was merciful compared to eternal damnation, but for those who endured it, the price of being saved was a lifetime of shame. Redemption, in this context, came wrapped in humiliation and fear, and for the crowd watching, it was a warning: obey or be next. When the Inquisition deemed that penance was not enough, or when a heretic refused to recant, the ultimate punishment was handed down: death. But even this was shaped by ritual. The executions were not quiet nor hidden. They were public, theatrical, and profoundly symbolic. The most infamous of these spectacles was the auto da fe, meaning act of faith, a grim ceremony where justice and doctrine fused into a horrifying display. Contrary to common belief, the Church did not directly execute heretics. It delivered the sentence and then handed the condemned over to secular authorities, who carried out the punishment. This legal fiction allowed the Church to maintain the illusion of spiritual mercy while still ensuring that the ultimate penalty was delivered. The auto da fe was the culmination of this process, a public declaration of both guilt and punishment. Held in large city squares, often after a grand mass, the auto da fe brought entire communities together. The condemned, sometimes a handful, sometimes dozens, were led in procession, wearing their sanbenitos and pointed caps called carrozas. They were paraded past crowds that included clergy, nobles, and commoners. Drums beat solemn rhythms, sermons were delivered, officials read aloud each person's sins and sentence. The event was not only spiritual, it was political, reinforcing church authority and uniting the public through shared fear. Executions were typically by burning, chosen for its symbolism: fire cleansed, fire purified. In some cases, the condemned were strangled before the flames were lit, a supposed mercy. In others, they were burned alive. Each act was meant to be a dramatic warning to all who watched. The smoke was believed to carry away the sin, or at least ensure no trace remained. For the faithful, it was a moment of grim celebration, the soul reclaimed for God, the community protected. The auto da fe was not just about punishment, it was performance. Music, pageantry, and pageant-like processions masked the violence with ritual. Children attended, merchants sold goods. Some communities even treated it like a festival. The moral message was clear: heresy would not be tolerated, and salvation would be enforced, even through fire. But behind the chants and the incense, the reality was cruel. Many condemned were not hardened rebels or outspoken heretics. They were often the vulnerable converted Jews and Muslims, accused witches, or those who had simply questioned doctrine in the wrong company. The auto da fe created martyrs, erased dissent, and silenced generations. Families changed their names, left their homes, abandoned their pasts to escape suspicion. The memory of these events lingers not because of their brutality alone, but because of their purpose. They weren't random, they were orchestrated. Each execution was a statement of power, dressed in religious language, designed to mold minds and bind communities. The flames that rose during the auto da fe weren't just for the condemned, they were lit for everyone watching, a vivid reminder that the Inquisition's reach extended beyond the tribunal and into the public soul. When Pope Gregory IX formalized the Papal Inquisition in the 1230s, he entrusted its execution to a new and rising religious group, the Dominican Order. Founded by Saint Dominic just a few decades earlier, the Dominicans were initially formed to combat heresy through preaching and education. They were seen as zealous, disciplined, and intellectually formidable qualities the Church believed made them ideal defenders of orthodoxy. But under the structure of the Inquisition, their role transformed dramatically from preachers of truth to enforcers of doctrine. The Dominicans were mendicants, meaning they renounced personal wealth and lived in poverty, surviving on donations. This gave them a certain credibility among the people, contrasting with the increasingly wealthy and politicized clergy. Their devotion was undeniable. They trained extensively in theology and logic, learning how to spot heresy in all its forms. But once they were granted inquisitorial powers, their scholarship became a weapon. They didn't simply debate heresy, they dissected it, categorized it, hunted it down. The Dominicans were methodical. They traveled in pairs, often entering a town with papal writs and the authority to interrogate, judge, and sentence. They maintained detailed manuals, procedural texts that guided how to question suspects, evaluate evidence, and administer spiritual correction. These handbooks standardized the Inquisition process across regions, ensuring a uniform approach. Each Dominican inquisitor was both a theologian and a bureaucrat, carrying the weight of divine authority in the form of ledgers, confessions, and papal orders. One of the most well-known Dominican inquisitors was Bernard Gui, a 14th-century friar whose name has become synonymous with the machinery of the Inquisition. His handbook, Practica Inquisitionis Heretis Pravitatis, laid out in painstaking detail how to identify heretics based on patterns of speech, behavior, and association. His writings reveal not just methods, but a mindset, a belief that heresy was a disease that had to be carefully diagnosed and eradicated. Gui and others like him viewed their work not as cruelty, but as duty. They were saving souls from eternal damnation. Any suffering endured in the process was, in their eyes, justified. This sense of righteousness made the Dominicans relentless. They were not driven by profit or politics. They were driven by belief, and that made them even more dangerous. But the Dominicans were not without criticism. In some areas, their presence was met with resentment. Townspeople feared their arrival, whispering warnings and hiding their books. Accusations of overreach and false judgments began to appear in some regions. Even other members of the church occasionally questioned the zeal with which the Dominicans pursued their tasks. The line between justice and persecution blurred, but the system rarely paused to reflect. Despite the growing unease, the Dominicans remained at the center of inquisitorial power for centuries. Their organizational skills, intellectual rigor, and unquestioning loyalty to the papacy made them ideal tools in maintaining religious control. They built networks, kept detailed records, and passed on knowledge to future generations of inquisitors. Their influence reached beyond tribunals, shaping how heresy was understood and prosecuted across the continent. What began as a mission to preach and uplift had become a mechanism of fear. The Dominicans had pledged to protect the faith, but in doing so, they helped build a system that punished doubt and crushed dissent. Their story is a reminder that even devotion can become dangerous when it is bound to unchecked power. The term Inquisition evokes many dark images, but none more infamous than the Spanish Inquisition. Established in 1478 by Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, this new tribunal operated under papal blessing but was controlled by the crown. Unlike earlier Inquisitions, which focused largely on doctrinal heresy, the Spanish Inquisition had an additional goal: national and religious unity under the newly unified Spanish kingdom. Its targets were not only spiritual dissenters but entire populations seen as ethnically or culturally suspect. Spain, in the late 15th century, was a land in flux. The Reconquista had just concluded with the conquest of Granada, ending centuries of Muslim rule. Jews and Muslims had lived in Iberia for generations, often in uneasy coexistence. But the Catholic monarchs now sought religious uniformity to strengthen their authority and forge a singular national identity. The Inquisition was the means to enforce this vision. Its first targets were conversus Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure or threat of exile. Many were sincere, but others continued to practice Judaism in secret. These so-called crypto-Jews became the obsession of the new tribunal. Accusations spread quickly. Neighbor turned on neighbor. Children testified against parents. Fear permeated every layer of society. The Spanish Inquisition operated under its own rules. Unlike earlier inquisitions led primarily by religious orders, it was a state institution. Inquisitors were appointed by the crown. Their authority superseded local bishops and often rivaled secular officials. Their methods were secretive. Arrests were made at night. Accused individuals were rarely told the charges or their accuser's identity. Torture was legal and frequently employed. Property was confiscated. Trials could last months or years. The inquisitorial chambers were symbols of both dread and control. They were dark, enclosed, and filled with echoes. Suspects were isolated. Those who confessed were often paraded in autos da fe, made to wear the dreaded San Benito, and sentenced publicly. But the Spanish Inquisition was also economically motivated. The property of the condemned could be seized and redistributed often, enriching officials and the crown. Yet perhaps most chilling was the Inquisition's permanence. It did not flare briefly and vanish. It endured for centuries. Its reach extended into the Americas, following colonists to the New World. It expanded its targets, hunting down Protestants, mystics, and anyone suspected of deviance from Catholic orthodoxy. Unlike earlier inquisitions, it was institutionalized at a national level, embedding itself into the fabric of Spanish life. By the end of the 15th century, Spain's Jewish population had been officially expelled. The Inquisition had become more than a religious force. It was a political weapon, a tool of unification through exclusion. It defined Spanishness, not only in terms of language or heritage, but in terms of conformity to Catholicism, and those who could not or would not conform were erased. The Spanish Inquisition marked a new chapter in the history of persecution. It took the methods and logic of earlier tribunals and applied them with ruthless efficiency. It blurred the line between faith and fear, between devotion and dominance, and it cast a shadow over Iberia that would last long after its final trial was held. One of the driving forces behind the intensity of the Spanish Inquisition was the fear of the hidden other, the belief that danger could come not from outsiders, but from within. Nowhere was this more evident than in the treatment of Jews and conversos. While Jews had lived in Spain for centuries, often contributing greatly to commerce, scholarship, and medicine, they were increasingly viewed with suspicion by the 15th century. That suspicion didn't end with conversion, it merely changed form. When King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree in 1492, it forced all Jews to convert to Christianity or leave the country. Tens of thousands chose exile. But many, under immense pressure, chose to convert. These new Christians were called conversos. In theory, they were now part of the Catholic fold. In practice, they remained under constant scrutiny. The Church and the Inquisition doubted the sincerity of these conversions. Any sign that a converso might still secretly observe Jewish customs, lighting candles on Friday nights, avoiding pork, whispering Hebrew prayers, could be seen as evidence of crypto-Judaism, a heresy punishable by death. It didn't take much. A neighbor's rumor, a servant's gossip, or an old grievance could spark an investigation. The fact that someone was a converso made them suspect by default. No defense could fully erase the stain of Jewish ancestry. This was more than religious suspicion. It became racialized. The concept of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, emerged in this period. It wasn't enough to be Christian in belief, you had to be Christian by lineage. Those with Jewish or Muslim ancestry, no matter how devout, were marked. This ideology created a caste system where old Christians looked down upon conversos and excluded them from positions of power, education, and even certain neighborhoods. The Inquisition capitalized on this divide. It encouraged citizens to report secret heresy. Households turned inward with fear. Conversos changed their names, altered family customs, and trained their children to behave like perfect Christians. Some even joined the Inquisition themselves, hoping to prove loyalty. But suspicion clung stubbornly. Entire family lines could be blacklisted, property seized, and reputations destroyed. Ironically, some of the most devout converts suffered the most. Their zeal drew attention, their attempt to blend in two perfectly raised alarms. For the Inquisition, no amount of faith could undo the supposed danger in their blood. Trials were brutal. Confessions, often extracted under torture, fed more accusations. A single trial could implicate dozens, creating waves of fear that tore through entire communities. The obsession with the hidden other fractured Spanish society. It cultivated an atmosphere of paranoia. It taught citizens to watch each other, to mistrust their neighbors, to fear even their own heritage. Families hid their pasts, burned ancestral texts, and reimagined their lineages. Identity became a performance, a matter of survival. The legacy of this persecution ran deep. It laid the groundwork for centuries of anti-Semitism, not just in Spain but across Europe. And it showed how the machinery of the Inquisition could be turned not just against beliefs but against identities themselves. What made the Inquisition so effective wasn't just its authority or its methods, it was the psychological weight it carried. The Inquisition turned fear into a tool of control, embedding it so deeply into the culture that people began to police themselves. This fear wasn't always fear of punishment. It was fear of being noticed, of being different, of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Over time, this fear bred silence. In many towns, the mere rumor of heresy could change everything. People began to avoid open conversation. They became cautious about their prayers, their food, their books. Even private actions could be interpreted as signs of deviance. Did you light candles too early on Friday? Did you murmur a blessing in an unfamiliar language? Did you hesitate during confession? Each of these might lead to inquiry. People were judged not only by what they believed, but by how well they appeared to believe. This pressure created a kind of societal conformity that was both pervasive and invisible. Families trained their children not to ask questions. Friends stopped discussing theology. Even simple traditions became dangerous. Cultural memory faded, not through force, but through collective survival. And because the Inquisition relied heavily on anonymous testimony, no one could be fully trusted. A friend might become an informant. A servant might overhear something incriminating. A rival could weaponize old grudges. Paranoia became the norm. Public life was shaped by the expectation of scrutiny. Church attendance was not just a matter of faith, but of necessity. Everyone had to be seen praying, participating, repenting. Absence raised suspicion. Excessive zeal did too. It was a narrow path between too little and too much. The safest way to live was quietly, invisibly, without distinction. The fear of the Inquisition didn't always stem from direct threat. For many, it was the stories that did the work, accounts of trials, whispers of confessions, rumors of torture. The Inquisition allowed its reputation to do much of the policing. It didn't need to be everywhere. People's imagination filled in the rest. This psychological presence made it more powerful than any army. In this environment, silence became a kind of language. It was how people protected themselves, their families, their past. Silence was a shield but also a prison. Over generations, it erased histories, severed cultural ties, and weakened communities. People forgot the songs, the customs, the languages of their ancestors, not because they rejected them, but because remembering them had become too dangerous. And yet, the Inquisition didn't just silence individuals. It reshaped entire societies. It taught people to look inward with suspicion and outward with caution. It stifled intellectual growth, discouraged inquiry, and replaced trust with surveillance. The fear it created lived longer than any trial and echoed far beyond the chambers of the tribunal. To understand how the Inquisition functioned so effectively and endured so long, one must look not only at the institutions behind it, but also into the minds of those who carried it out. The Inquisitor was not merely an administrator of faith or a passive reader of laws. He was judge, detective, theologian, and moral enforcer all wrapped in one robe. He did not see himself as cruel, but as a shepherd guiding straying sheep back to the fold, no matter how harsh the correction. The terrifying truth is that most inquisitors believed they were doing good. These men were products of their time, shaped by a worldview where spiritual danger was more real and more urgent than physical harm. A heretic was not just someone who disagreed. He was someone who threatened the eternal souls of others. False belief spread like a disease, and the inquisitor saw himself as the physician. If he had to cut or cauterize to save the body, he would. That was the logic. Better a soul suffer now than burn forever. This mindset was what made the institution so coldly efficient. Inquisitors trained in theological schools, studying doctrine with intense precision. They memorized scripture, debated heresy in its many forms, and mastered the art of confession and interrogation. Their manuals didn't merely instruct them on process, they taught them how to think. Doubt, hesitation, and sympathy for the accused were seen as potential signs of spiritual weakness. Certainty was prized. Righteousness was the engine of justice. But the inquisitor's role was not easy. The emotional toll was real, even if history rarely records it. Some questioned the methods privately. Others found themselves hardened over time. There are rare accounts of inquisitors who resigned or who begged forgiveness for those they condemned. But far more common were those who embraced their mission fully, men who believed that they alone stood between the faithful and chaos. Their decisions shaped fates, and their signatures marked the point of no return. Inquisitors were also political beings. Though ostensibly servants of the church, many gained prestige, power, and influence. Their actions could please monarchs or provoke backlash from local leaders. Some inquisitors pursued heresy with calculated ambition, knowing that a high-profile conviction could advance their careers. The line between spiritual conviction and political self-interest often blurred. But from the outside, it all looked the same, a relentless machine, issuing judgments in the name of God. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the inquisitor's mindset was its moral clarity. There was rarely doubt. The tribunal wasn't a place of open debate, it was a place of correction. To question the process was to risk becoming suspect, and so the inquisitors pressed forward methodical, dispassionate, certain. They built their judgments not on malice, but on conviction. And that made them all the more dangerous. In the eyes of an inquisitor, justice was not about fairness, it was about faith. Truth came from scripture, not from evidence. Confession was the highest form of proof. And the soul was a battlefield on which error must be conquered at any cost. This absolute belief turned ordinary men into arbiters of unimaginable suffering, all while convinced they were instruments of divine mercy. Although the Inquisition primarily targeted beliefs, not demographics, women often found themselves disproportionately vulnerable to its reach. In a world where their voices carried less weight, their behaviors were more scrutinized, and their independence was often viewed with suspicion, women were easy targets. Their suffering under the Inquisition reveals not just theological intolerance, but the deep gender inequalities embedded in medieval society. Women were accused for a variety of reasons, some religious, others personal. A widow who read too much, a midwife whose remedies were unfamiliar, a woman who refused marriage or challenged authority. These acts, though mundane today, could be interpreted as signs of spiritual defiance or hidden heresy. In some cases, women were charged with practicing witchcraft or consorting with the devil. These accusations often emerged from local rumors, jealousy, or fear of female autonomy. Once accused, women faced unique challenges. They were less likely to be literate, making it harder to defend themselves or navigate the tribunal process. They lacked access to powerful advocates. And the very traits that made them suspect assertiveness, knowledge, solitude also made them poor candidates for mercy. The Inquisition viewed deviation from gender norms as a kind of spiritual threat. A woman who acted outside her prescribed role was dangerous, and danger required correction. Many trials reveal a disturbing pattern: women confessing under pressure to impossible acts, admitting to heresies they didn't understand, often simply to make the ordeal stop. Some were imprisoned for life. Others were forced to wear sanbenitos and live in public shame. And some were sentenced to death, not necessarily because of what they believed, but because of who they were. Worse still, the Inquisition often conflated female piety with hysteria. Women who had visions, heard voices, or experienced spiritual ecstasy were viewed with suspicion. Mysticism in men could be celebrated. In women, it was dangerous. Some female saints were posthumously questioned. Others were denied sainthood altogether due to doctrinal concerns about their uncontrolled experiences. Spiritual passion in women had to be carefully regulated, lest it slip into heresy. Yet, despite these threats, some women resisted. They formed quiet communities, passed down prayers and stories in secret, and supported one another during trials. Others became martyrs, dying not just for faith, but for dignity. Their courage, recorded only in fragments, stands as a quiet defiance against a system that tried to silence them. The Inquisition's treatment of women reflected the broader fears of the time. Women who stepped beyond the expected roles intellectually, spiritually, or socially were punished not only for their ideas, but for their audacity. Their stories remind us that the Inquisition didn't just fight heresy, it enforced conformity. And in that conformity, many women were crushed. Within the shadowed chambers of the Inquisition, truth was not uncovered through conversation, it was extracted. Torture, while not unique to the Inquisition, became systematized within its legal procedures, viewed not as cruelty, but as a means to uncover the divine will hidden beneath human deception. It was not used recklessly, at least not in theory. It followed rules, guidelines, and thresholds. But these formalities did little to shield the victims from the pain or the psychological trauma that followed. The logic behind the use of torture was both chilling and calculated. Heresy was considered a hidden Crimea corruption of the soul, often invisible on the surface. Confessions were seen as necessary not only for punishment, but for salvation. If a person would not confess, it was not proof of innocence, but of stubborn pride, perhaps even satanic influence. Torture, then, became a holy act, a method to break the body in order to save the soul. Victims were not told who had accused them. They were rarely given a chance to present evidence or defend themselves. Once suspicion was confirmed through rumor, behavior, or association, the tribunal had wide latitude to act. Torture was allowed only once per person, but inquisitors often divided the session into phases, stretching the definition to justify multiple applications. And if the accused passed out or could not speak, the session could resume at a later time. The devices used were designed not to kill, but to terrify and torment. The strappado involved binding the victim's hands behind their back and suspending them from a rope, then dropping them suddenly to wrench the shoulders. The rack stretched the limbs to unnatural lengths. The heretic's fork, a double-pronged collar, prevented rest or speech. These tools were horrifying not just for the pain they inflicted, but for the silence they imposed. Even after the session ended, the fear of it lingered. Women, the elderly, and even children were not exempt. Though clerics sometimes debated the morality of torturing the young or frail, the fear of heresy overruled such concerns. For some, the mere threat of torture was enough. Others broke under its weight, confessing to anything, naming others, and fabricating entire heresies just to make the pain stop. But once a confession was given, the damage was done. Even if recanted, it remained in the record. It justified further punishment, imprisonment, or even execution. Torture left more than bruises, it planted seeds of fear that spread through entire communities. People became cautious not only in speech, but in thought. Any deviation from orthodoxy could end in pain. The Church maintained that torture was an unfortunate necessity, a last resort. But the records reveal how frequently it was used, how deeply it was woven into the process. The Inquisition saw itself as both surgeon and shepherd, cutting away corruption to preserve purity. And in that mission, the suffering of the few was seen as justified by the salvation of the many. The cruelty of these methods is undeniable, yet their purpose was not mindless brutality, it was calculated control. Torture created not only confessions but silence, obedience, and fear. It carved out a space where the Church's authority could not be questioned, and for those who survived, it created scars that could never be seen but never stopped aching. The Inquisition's reach did not end with the condemned. It stretched beyond the trial, the sentence, and the punishment into the lives of family members, and especially into the futures of their children. The guilt of heresy became generational. To be born into the wrong household, to share blood with the accused, was often enough to live under suspicion for a lifetime. When a person was convicted of heresy, their name was entered into a permanent record, one that followed their lineage like a curse. Sons and daughters found their marriages denied, their inheritances revoked, their careers blocked. They were often barred from joining guilds, entering universities, or holding positions of civic or religious authority. The sins of the parent, real or alleged, became a lifelong burden on the child. In many cases, children were forcibly removed from their homes. The Church reasoned that allowing them to stay with condemned heretics would endanger their souls. These children were placed in monasteries or with loyal Christian families, raised under strict supervision to erase any traces of their parents' influence. Though framed as an act of mercy, this severing of familial ties was deeply traumatic. It erased language, memory, identity. Children who remained with their families lived in quiet fear. They learned early how to avoid attention, how to suppress questions, how to behave with rigid orthodoxy. They became experts in silence. Some grew up to renounce their pasts, eager to align with the very system that had punished their parents. Others internalized the shame, retreating into isolated lives. The psychological toll was immense. These children carried invisible weights, unanswered questions, fractured histories, and a constant sense of being watched. Some sought justice, only to find the Inquisition's archives sealed. Others tried to reclaim family honor, but the stains were indelible. The Church did not easily forget, and society did not forgive. Yet these children were not just passive victims. Some resisted in subtle ways, preserving stories, secretly passing down books, or keeping family traditions alive in coded forms. In their resilience, they challenged the Inquisition's most insidious claim, that it could not only control the present, but shape the future. Generational persecution is one of the Inquisition's most haunting legacies. It weaponized family ties, transforming love into liability. It taught people that heritage could be a crime. And in doing so, it ensured that the pain of a single trial could echo through decades. The children of the accused remind us that fear was not confined to the courtroom. It lived in homes, in memories, and in the quiet spaces where identity was both a danger and a source of strength. The Inquisition was not merely a system of secret interrogations and silent accusations. It was also a theater of power. One of the most striking tools it used to reinforce its authority was the public spectacle. Trials may have been held in dim chambers, but the punishments, penance, and executions were often brought into the light of day, where entire communities could witness and internalize the consequences of heresy. These events were more than punishment, they were performance. Perhaps the most infamous of these spectacles was the auto da fe, or act of faith. Contrary to popular myth, not every auto da fe ended in fire. It was a ritualized public ceremony during which those convicted by the Inquisition were brought before the crowd to receive their sentences. The event might include public prayers, processions, and theatrical displays of remorse or defiance. The condemned were forced to wear special garments, such as the San Benito, a robe emblazoned with symbols of their crimes, flames, crosses, or devils. These outfits made sure no one could miss them in the crowd. The purpose of the spectacle was twofold. First, it was meant to demonstrate the Church's authority. By displaying its ability to judge and punish, the Inquisition reminded everyone that deviation would not be tolerated. Second, it served to reinforce communal norms. Spectators weren't just watching justice, they were being warned. The public setting created a shared experience of fear and moral pressure. Everyone knew someone who had once stood in that square. The boundary between spectator and suspect was thin. Some autos da fe were modest affairs, held in small-town plazas. Others were elaborate and choreographed, especially in major cities like Seville or Toledo. Rulers and nobles attended, clergy gave speeches, and the condemned sometimes numbered in the dozens. In some cases, prisoners were paraded through the city before arriving at the scaffold. There was music, chanting, and recitation of confessions. The tension hung heavy in the air as everyone waited for the final sentence, reconciliation, penance, or the ultimate punishment. The condemned faced different fates. Some were reconciled with the Church and allowed to return to their communities under strict restrictions. Others were sentenced to life in prison. The most severe punishments ended in execution, often by burning, carried out by civil authorities. While the Inquisition claimed to focus on spiritual correction, its rituals often ended with death. For the crowd, these events were complex. Some came out of fear, others came from curiosity, and some, disturbingly, came for entertainment. Chronicles describe cheers, gasps, even street vendors selling food. Over time, the auto da fe became a part of civic life, blurring the line between sacred ceremony and public spectacle. It turned punishment into ritual, and ritual into routine. But not all responses were celebratory. Many spectators left in silence, their hearts heavy with unease. Children cried, mothers clutched their families. Even in a society accustomed to violence, the sight of a neighbor being condemned, humiliated, or worse, left marks. The spectacle worked not because it numbed, but because it etched itself into memory. The Inquisition knew this. That's why it used theater not just as a weapon of punishment, but as a tool of culture. In this way, the Inquisition extended its power beyond walls and parchment. It entered the streets, the markets, the everyday rhythm of life. And in doing so, it turned fear into something visible, something everyone could watch, remember, and never quite forget. In the eyes of the Inquisition, confession was not just a legal admission of guilt, it was a spiritual milestone. The entire structure of inquisitorial justice hinged on the belief that a heretic could be saved if they repented. But behind this concept of mercy lay a system designed to extract, control, and ultimately own a person's truth. Confession, while presented as a voluntary act of the soul, was in practice something far more complex. Confessing during an Inquisition trial was rarely spontaneous. The accused faced immense pressure from interrogators, from isolation, from uncertainty. Days or weeks of questioning wore down defenses. The environment was carefully constructed to make confession seem like the only escape, and in many cases, it was. Those who confessed were more likely to receive leniency, but that mercy came with conditions. A full confession often required the naming of accomplices, detailing of hidden practices, and renunciation of past beliefs. Even fabricated confessions were accepted if they supported inquisitorial expectations. It was not uncommon for individuals to confess to practices they had never engaged in simply because the pain of silence had become unbearable, and once words were spoken, they became permanent. Retracting a confession was nearly impossible and usually led to harsher punishment. The ritual of confession was also performative. Public recantations were part of the spectacle. The accused would speak before the crowd, admitting their error, begging forgiveness, and proclaiming loyalty to the Church. These confessions, often scripted or rehearsed, served to validate the system itself. They turned the condemned into proof that the Inquisition's methods worked. Contrition, the emotional and spiritual regret for sin, was deeply valued by the Church, but in the inquisitorial process, it became another standard to measure compliance. A confession without visible contrition could be considered insufficient. The accused were expected to show remorse not only in words, but in demeanor. Tears, bowed heads, trembling hands, these became the marks of a true return to the faith. Failure to display proper contrition could lead to further punishment. The tribunal might decide that the soul had not truly turned back to God. In this way, the Inquisition judged not only actions but emotions. It scrutinized the inner landscape of belief, demanding not just obedience but transformation. This made the process deeply invasive. It wasn't enough to recite a prayer or admit to a mistake. The accused had to surrender their entire inner world. Their thoughts, doubts, historias, everything became part of the Church's domain, and even after confession, the road did not end. Many were sentenced to penance, imprisonment, or years of public shame. Some were released but forced to wear markings of their past guilt. Forgiveness was offered, but never truly free. Yet for some, confession brought genuine relief. It allowed them to speak, to be heard, to unburden. Others found in it a way to survive a calculated choice to protect themselves or their families. The meaning of confession was never singular. It was spiritual, political, emotional, and strategic all at once. The Inquisition's obsession with confession shows how deeply it sought to dominate not just behavior, but belief. In demanding total honesty, it also demanded total surrender. And in doing so, it blurred the line between salvation and submission, between redemption and control. Fire has long held a powerful place in human symbolism. It cleanses, destroys, illuminates, and terrifies. In the context of the Inquisition, fire became the ultimate agent of purification, a theatrical, final solution meant to rid the world of heresy and demonstrate the indomitable will of the Church. Burnings were not common everyday events, but when they did happen, they were unforgettable. They transformed belief into spectacle, turning spiritual deviance into public warning. Officially, the Church did not execute heretics, it handed them over to secular authorities. This technicality allowed religious leaders to maintain a veil of moral distance. Yet the entire process, from trial to sentencing, was orchestrated by the Inquisition. The secular arm simply carried out the punishment already prescribed. The condemned were often stripped of their rights, their property confiscated, and their names disgraced. The fire that followed was seen not as punishment, but as purification. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about saving the soul, even if the body had to be sacrificed. The execution site was often just outside the city, a place where crowds could gather safely but not interfere. A scaffold or platform was constructed, the wood carefully arranged, and a stake placed at the center. The condemned, sometimes bound and gagged, were brought forward wearing the sanbenito, a garment that marked their supposed crimes. In some cases, they were allowed to speak one last time. In others, silence reigned. The procession from prison to fire was itself a ritual, a slow-moving tide of symbols and power. The atmosphere at these executions was surreal. Clergy stood nearby, chanting prayers. Officials gave formal statements. The public watched from a distance, some with tears, others with curiosity, and a few with approval. The accused were not merely executed, they were displayed. Their suffering became part of the communal rhythm, part of the memory of the town. The burning served as a cleansing not just for the individual, but for the entire community. Sometimes, a figure would recant at the final moment, begging forgiveness and renouncing their errors. In rare instances, this led to mercy, a swift death before the flames could consume them. But often, the fire was still lit. The soul might be saved, but the body would still burn. Other times, the condemned remained defiant to the end. They refused to confess, refused to kneel, and faced the fire with silence or curses on their lips. These moments left lasting impressions, etched into oral histories, and later chronicled as warnings or acts of bravery. Burnings were not frequent enough to be routine, but they were always remembered. Children who saw them grew into adults who told the stories. The scent, the light, the smoke rising against the sky, these details stayed imprinted. Whether seen as justice or horror, the event worked as intended. It carved obedience into the heart of the people, reminding them of what was at stake. And for those who watched, the questions remained long after the ashes cooled. Was the heretic truly guilty? Was the church truly just? Could fear really bring faith? The fire answered none of these questions. It only silenced them, and in that silence, the Inquisition thrived. For the Inquisition, few things were more dangerous than a heretic who had already confessed and then strayed again. These individuals were called relapsi, or relapsed heretics, and they were treated with particular severity. The Church believed that these souls had once been shown the path of truth and had consciously rejected it a second time. In a world that valued confession and contrition above all, this second offense was seen as deliberate rebellion, and rebellion, especially spiritual rebellion, could not go unanswered. The process leading to relapse varied. Some individuals confessed under pressure, then later returned to their previous beliefs in private. Others tried to quietly resume forbidden practices, reading banned texts, meeting with old groups, or speaking heretical ideas. In some cases, the relapse was nothing more than rumor or suspicion. But for the Inquisition, a second accusation carried far more weight than the first. The punishment for a relapso was nearly always severe. Unlike first-time offenders who might be given penance or even reconciliation, the relapsed were considered beyond correction. They were more likely to face life imprisonment, public humiliation, or execution. In many records, the tribunals made it clear mercy had already been extended once. There would not be a second offering. Being labeled a relapso was not always the result of new heresy. Sometimes, the Inquisition revisited old cases years later, questioning whether the original confession had been sincere. If they found discrepancies or signs of false contrition, they could reopen the file and declare the person a relapsed heretic retroactively. This practice created a haunting sense of unfinished judgment. Even those who had confessed and moved on could suddenly find themselves dragged back into scrutiny. Families of the relapsed suffered deeply. The stigma was stronger, the punishments harsher. Property was seized, names were marked, and children were ostracized. In some towns, the homes of the relapsi were permanently labeled with symbols of shame. Even in death, their bodies could be exhumed and publicly condemned, their bones burned in place of the living flesh. Despite this, some people continued to challenge the orthodoxy. They spoke in whispers, studied in secret, or gathered quietly in forests and back rooms. These were not always rebels in the modern sense. They were often simply believers, seekers, or thinkers whose views had shifted. But in the eyes of the Church, they had committed the ultimate betrayal, turning away from the light after having already been saved. The fear of relapse created a chilling effect across society. Even those who had been cleared remained under pressure to perform their faith flawlessly. A single misstep, a missed Mass, a misunderstood word, a lapse in ritual could be interpreted as relapse. This vigilance wore people down. It turned faith into performance and community into surveillance. In punishing the relapsed, the Inquisition made a brutal example. It declared that belief was not a private matter, but a permanent public duty. Once brought into the Church's fold, one could never leave. Apostasy wasn't just error, it was betrayal, and betrayal had only one end. While the Inquisition worked tirelessly to root out heresy, not every forbidden belief vanished under its pressure. In cities and countrysides across medieval Europe, communities and individuals found ways to continue practicing their faiths in secret. These hidden faiths, sustained quietly under the weight of fear and persecution, tell a story of resilience, devotion, and the human need for spiritual identity. The most well-known of these underground believers were conversus Jews, who had converted to Christianity, often under duress, but continued to observe Jewish customs in secret. These crypto-Jews lit Sabbath candles in shuttered rooms, whispered prayers in the dark, and passed on their traditions to their children in coded language and careful rituals. They walked a dangerous line, pretending outwardly to be good Christians while preserving their inner convictions in silence. Muslim converts, or Moriscos, faced similar scrutiny. After the fall of Granada in 1492, thousands of Muslims were forced to convert. Some did so sincerely, others in name only. Secretly, many still observed Ramadan, avoided pork, and prayed facing Mecca. But the Inquisition watched them closely. Any sign of backsliding could bring interrogation or worse. There were also Christian groups, such as the Waldensians and Cathars, who clung to what they believed to be purer versions of the faith. Though often driven into remote mountains or foreign cities, these sects maintained contact through secret messengers and hidden texts. Their members met in caves, barns, and cellars, whispering scripture by candlelight, always alert to betrayal. The Inquisition responded with increasing sophistication. It trained informants to spot Judaizing behaviors, such as avoiding pork or wearing clean clothes on Saturdays. It taught priests to listen for unusual phrasing in confessions. It scrutinized burial customs, kitchen habits, and even how people bathed. Daily life became a minefield of possible suspicion. To survive, hidden believers developed layers of protection. They used coded language calling the Sabbath a day of rest, or referring to sacred texts as old books. They built false walls in their homes to hide ritual items. Children were taught from an early age what to say in public and what to keep private. The family became both sanctuary and battleground. Despite the risk, many of these underground communities persisted for generations. Their members held fast not out of rebellion, but out of devotion. They believed that truth lived in the old ways, and that the Inquisition, despite its power, could not erase the soul's memory. Their survival speaks to a profound human instinct, the refusal to let go of meaning, even in the face of death. But the cost was high. Families lived in constant fear. A single slip could unravel everything. Many were eventually discovered, arrested, and punished. Their homes were seized, their children taken, their names dragged through public shame. The secret life came with constant anxiety, and yet, despite everything, it endured. The story of hidden faiths is not just about resistance, it's about identity. It reminds us that belief is not always loud or public. Sometimes, it is quiet and stubborn, burning like a candle behind a closed door. And that, too, is a form of courage. Fear was the Inquisition's greatest weapon. More than any torture device, more than any public execution, fear seeped into the walls of towns, into the prayers of villagers, and into the private thoughts of every citizen. It spread not by sword, but by silence, and in that silence, the Inquisition flourished. This fear wasn't always loud or dramatic. Often, it took the form of small hesitations, choosing not to speak a controversial opinion, avoiding an old friend, crossing the street to steer clear of someone whispered about. It was subtle and creeping, a force that turned ordinary life into a careful performance. People monitored their words, their habits, even their gestures. A raised eyebrow, an unanswered question, a visit to the wrong home, these could be enough to raise suspicion. Entire communities became entangled in webs of paranoia. Neighbors watched each other. Friends turned cautious. Families began to hide things even from one another. The Inquisition encouraged this atmosphere, rewarding informants, validating rumors and broadcasting its authority through proclamations and penalties. Everyone knew that no one was immune. The effect was devastating. Intellectual discussion withered. Books were burned or hidden. Art became tamer, more orthodox. Sermons were monitored. Even private devotion was adjusted to avoid suspicion. Faith, once a personal journey, became a public act. Everyone was expected to demonstrate their orthodoxy not just in church, but in daily life. Children learned early what not to say. They were taught how to answer questions from priests, how to avoid speaking of unusual family traditions. Inquisitors sometimes questioned them directly, believing that children were more honest or more easily manipulated. The innocence of childhood became a source of vulnerability. One of the most insidious results of this fear was self-censorship. People began to internalize the expectations of the Inquisition so deeply that they edited their own thoughts. Even in solitude, they were wary. The mind became a guarded space. Doubt was dangerous. Curiosity, too. Safety lay in sameness, in repetition, in silence. Some tried to push back. A few brave souls spoke openly, defended their neighbors, or questioned the church's methods. But most learned to survive in quiet compliance. The cost of resistance was too high. And so, fear became normal. It became part of the atmosphere, like smoke from a distant fire that never quite cleared. And that was the Inquisition's true power. It didn't need to knock on every door or punish every heretic. It needed only to be believed capable of doing so. The mere idea of being watched was enough. In that environment, the people became their own jailers. They built the walls, they locked the doors, and the Inquisition simply watched them do it. To modernize, the idea of fearing books may seem absurd. But during the Inquisition, books were not simply collections of knowledge, they were dangerous vessels of ideas. In a world where the written word had power to inspire, to question, and to spread forbidden doctrine, the control of literature became a central mission. The Inquisition believed that to read the wrong book was to risk eternal damnation, and so it set out to silence the page. One of the most notorious tools in this crusade was the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, Index of Forbidden Books. This was a living list, updated repeatedly over centuries, detailing works deemed heretical, immoral, or theologically incorrect. It wasn't limited to theological treatises. The index banned scientific works, philosophical essays, even poetry that challenged orthodoxy. To own a forbidden book was risky. To be caught reading one was dangerous. To lend only disastrous. The fear of books extended to their production. Scribes and printers were subject to inspection. Before printing a text, they often had to seek church approval. Censors were appointed to review content, and any hint of dissent could shut down an entire operation. Inquisitors sometimes raided libraries or personal collections, seizing texts and interrogating owners about their sources. Monks were ordered to destroy ancient manuscripts that did not align with current doctrine, a loss that haunts historians to this day. The destruction of books was not a rare or impulsive act, it was organized and methodical. Bonfires were built not just for flesh, but for parchment. Pages soaked in ink, lovingly bound and copied by hand, were thrown into flames. In public ceremonies, the burning of books became a symbol of moral cleansing. Crowds watched as knowledge turned to ash. The church believed it was protecting souls, but in doing so, it often destroyed centuries of thought and creativity. People responded to this threat in different ways. Some gave up their books willingly, afraid of what might happen if they didn't. Others hid them. False walls, secret compartments, and even buried chests became part of the effort to preserve precious volumes. Some families passed down forbidden books in secret, copying them by hand, disguising them under fake titles, or memorizing them word for word so that they might live on even if the pages did not. The crackdown on books affected education. Universities had to revise curricula to avoid problematic texts. Philosophers were forced to cloak their arguments in theological language. Scientific progress slowed, shackled by the need to appear pious, and artists, too, began to self-censor, wary of literary themes that could be interpreted as rebellious. The fear was not just about what a book said, but what it could inspire. A single phrase could ignite doubt. A single paragraph could raise questions. The church feared that once an idea took root in the mind, it could grow beyond control. And they were right. Ideas are resilient. Even when banned, they persist. They survive in margins, in memory, in code. And so, the fear of books became a fear of the imagination. It wasn't just heresy that was on trial, it was the human desire to ask, to explore, to understand. The Inquisition sought to tame that desire, to reduce thought to obedience. But in doing so, it revealed just how powerful books truly are. In the patriarchal structure of medieval society, women were already subject to restriction. But under the Inquisition, their vulnerability deepened. Women were both targets and symbols, viewed as spiritually weaker, more susceptible to heresy, and, paradoxically, more dangerous when they strayed from obedience. The Church saw itself as protector of purity, and when women were accused, it often claimed to be saving them from themselves. In truth, the Inquisition gave the appearance of spiritual care while subjecting many women to brutal scrutiny. Many female victims were healers, midwives, or wise women roles that placed them in positions of knowledge and influence. Their skills, especially when connected to herbs or folk practices, were easily labeled as suspicious. Though the witch hunts would reach their peak in later centuries, the seeds were already present. A woman who healed could be accused of invoking unholy forces. A woman who led prayer in her home could be seen as undermining clerical authority. Female mystics, too, faced danger. While some were embraced by the church, like Hildegard of Bingen, others were accused of heresy for claiming visions, speaking directly to God, or interpreting scripture. Their spirituality was a threat when it stepped beyond the boundaries of approved doctrine. Visionaries were interrogated, forced to recant, or condemned outright. Their writings, when preserved, are often marked by tones of fear and self-effacement, proof of how carefully they had to tread. Married women and widows were not immune. If their husbands were accused, they might be interrogated as well. If they showed too much support, it could be interpreted as guilt. If they showed too little, it was heartlessness. Women walked a narrow line, judged by standards that shifted depending on circumstance. And once accused, they faced the same tortures, the same humiliations, and the same public penance as men. Confession was particularly complex for women. In a world where female speech was often devalued, confessing before male inquisitors placed them in a perilous position. They were expected to be humble, emotional, and obedient, yet also coherent, detailed, and truthful. Any sign of hesitation could be seen as deception, any confidence as arrogance. Their very presence in the process was a paradox, both central and disposable. Some women were not content to remain silent. There were female heretics who led underground groups, taught forbidden texts, and resisted arrest. Their courage is often buried in records written by their accusers, but it lingers. These women defied the roles imposed on them, and they paid dearly. The Inquisition showed no mercy to women who challenged its power. It stripped them of children, property, dignity, and sometimes life. But even in the midst of repression, women found ways to endure. Some survived by navigating the system, using tears and penance as shields. Others preserved knowledge through oral tradition, passing stories down through daughters and apprentices. A few turned to mysticism as a means of escape, seeking refuge not from the church, but in a God they imagined beyond it. The Inquisition feared women not just for what they did, but for what they represented: an unpredictable spirit, a challenge to control, a flicker of autonomy in a world obsessed with submission. and so it sought to contain them. But as history shows, the spirit does not cage easily. When the Inquisition targeted individuals, it rarely stopped at just one person. Accusations echoed through families, and for the children of those condemned, the consequences could be lifelong. These children bore not only the emotional toll of loss, but also a legacy of suspicion, poverty, and shame. In the eyes of the Inquisition, the sins of the father or mother could stain an entire lineage. If a parent was accused of heresy, the family faced immediate disruption. The home might be searched, property seized, and reputations ruined. Children could witness their parents dragged away in chains, with no explanation other than whispered warnings and fearful glances. Some were left behind with relatives or neighbors. Others were placed under church custody, especially if the Inquisition suspected that heretical beliefs had been passed on to them. Orphans of heretics were particularly vulnerable. With their parents' names tarnished and assets confiscated, many grew up in poverty. Their education was limited, and their opportunities restricted. Some were sent to monasteries or convents under watchful eyes, expected to serve a faith that had taken their families away. Others faced rejection from communities that feared contamination by association. Beyond the practical consequences, there was the burden of stigma. A child's surname could become a mark of shame. People remembered. Gossip lingered. In some towns, public records labeled descendants of heretics, effectively branding them. Even those who sought to live quietly, who obeyed every rule, found that the past shadowed them. The Inquisition encouraged this legacy of suspicion, believing it discouraged future heresy. Some children, especially the older ones, were directly interrogated. They were questioned about their parents' beliefs, household rituals, or conversations they might have overheard. This placed them in an impossible position: betray a loved one or risk being accused themselves. Inquisitors believed children were malleable, easier to manipulate. The result was often coerced testimony, riddled with confusion, fear, and guilt. And yet, even in such bleak circumstances, some children resisted. They protected family secrets, passed on forbidden knowledge in whispers, or carried small relics of belief in hidden pockets. Others grew up to challenge the very institutions that had shattered their lives, becoming critics, reformers, or chroniclers of the Inquisition's abuses. Though rare, these stories of resilience shine as quiet testaments to the endurance of memory and identity. Still, the dominant experience was silence. Most children carried their grief in private. They lived with questions they could never ask, stories they could never share, and fears they could not name. The trauma of the Inquisition stretched across generations. It was not just a moment in time, it was a scar etched into family trees. In condemning heresy, the Inquisition claimed to be defending truth. But in punishing children for their parents' beliefs, it revealed something far darker: a willingness to corrupt innocence for the sake of control. The children of the accused serve as a haunting reminder that no one was truly safe, not even those too young to understand the accusations that shaped their lives. The Inquisition has often been described as a religious institution, but its true nature was deeply entangled with political power. At its core, it was a system of control not only over belief, but over people, property, and influence. Monarchs, bishops, nobles, and inquisitors formed an uneasy alliance, using heresy as a justification for consolidating authority and suppressing dissent. From the beginning, the Inquisition served multiple masters. While it answered nominally to the Pope, it often worked closely with local rulers. In Spain, this alliance was especially pronounced. Ferdinand and Isabella established the Spanish Inquisition not just to protect the faith, but to unify their realm. By rooting out heresy, they also eliminated rival factions, seized wealth, and enforced ideological conformity. Inquisitors became political actors, their tribunals tools of statecraft. Property seizure played a major role. When someone was accused of heresy, Their assets were often confiscated, split between the church and the crown. This created a troubling incentive. Heresy became profitable. Accusations could be fueled by jealousy, greed, or ambition. Wealthy individuals, especially those with controversial views or foreign origins, were easy targets. Their downfall enriched those in power. The Inquisition also silenced political opponents. Dissenters who questioned royal policies or church corruption could be labeled heretics. Intellectuals, reformers, and even members of the clergy faced accusations when they threatened the status quo. The cloak of religious righteousness covered acts of political suppression. Faith became a mask for force. In towns and cities, the Inquisition's presence reshaped civic life. Local leaders deferred to inquisitors. Municipal councils coordinated with tribunals. Fear of accusation muted criticism and bred loyalty. Even those who privately doubted the system learned to perform piety and allegiance. The result was a culture of obedience, sustained not by truth but by fear. But power always invites resistance. In some regions, there were protests, subtle or open. Townspeople challenged inquisitorial decisions. Clergy wrote secret letters of dissent, and rumors circulated of bribes and corruption. Some nobles resented the Inquisition's interference in their domains. Though dangerous, these tensions revealed that power was never absolute. Still, the Inquisition persisted for centuries because it adapted. It presented itself as a defender of unity, a shield against chaos. And in times of uncertainty, plague, war, political instability, people often accepted repression in exchange for order. The Inquisition exploited this instinct, offering certainty in a fractured world. By merging religious dogma with political machinery, the Inquisition blurred the line between sin and treason. It turned belief into legislation and doubt into defiance. The deeper one looks into its structure, the clearer it becomes. The Inquisition was never just about faith. It was about who held the right to define it, enforce it, and profit from its protection. One of the most chilling aspects of the Inquisition was how it could fracture the very institutions it claimed to protect. While it's often remembered for targeting heretics among the laity or converted populations, the Inquisition also turned inward. Priests, monks, abbots, and even bishops found themselves accused, investigated, and sometimes condemned. When clergy turned on their own, the Church's internal unity crumbled under the weight of fear, envy, and ambition. Clergy were not immune to suspicion. In fact, their influence made them more vulnerable. A priest with unorthodox views, a monk with too many followers, or a bishop who resisted inquisitorial authority could become targets. Some were accused of spreading heretical sermons, others of consorting with banned texts. Even theological debates, once a core part of scholarly life, became dangerous ground. The line between interpretation and heresy narrowed until even curiosity could be fatal. The accusations often came from within. Monastic communities, with their strict hierarchies and enclosed lives, could foster rivalries. A lower-ranking monk might accuse a superior to gain favor or out of personal grievance. In cathedrals, ambitious clerics might target rivals to rise through the ranks. The Inquisition gave them the means. Anonymous denunciations were encouraged, and the veil of secrecy ensured that motives remained hidden. Once an accusation was made, the process moved quickly: interrogation, examination, and public humiliation, if not outright punishment. In some cases, entire orders were placed under scrutiny. The Franciscans and Dominicans, for instance, were not monolithic. Within their ranks, reformist factions often clashed with traditionalists. These internal conflicts could spill into inquisitorial courts, where one group accused the other of deviating from doctrine. The Inquisition, originally staffed largely by Dominicans, could favor one side and silence the other, reshaping the future of whole religious orders through subtle persecution. What made these betrayals so potent was their spiritual dimension. Clergy were not only colleagues, they were spiritual brothers. To accuse one was to shatter bonds forged through shared rituals and sacred vows. And yet, under pressure from the Inquisition, these bonds were frequently severed. Loyalty to doctrine outweighed loyalty to fellowship. Fear of contamination trumped compassion. The accused priests faced not only professional ruin, but deep spiritual isolation. A priest defrocked by the Inquisition lost not just a role, but an identity. He was cut off from the sacraments, stripped of status, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes burned. For those who believed deeply, this was not merely punishment, it was a kind of soul death. And for those who watched it happen to their peers, it was a warning. No robe, no collar, no title could protect them. Despite the risks, some clergy stood their ground. A few defended their peers, argued against the excesses of the tribunals, or refused to participate in questionable investigations. Some wrote carefully veiled critiques, cloaked in theological language. Others simply remained silent, withdrawing from public debate as a form of quiet resistance. These moments of defiance were rare, but they mattered. They proved that not everyone within the system accepted its logic. But in most cases, silence prevailed. Self-preservation demanded conformity. The cost of dissent was too high, the reach of the Inquisition too long. And so, even within the walls of monasteries and churches, suspicion grew. The shepherds turned on one another, and the flock watched in fear. In the world of the Inquisition, confession was everything. It was the gateway to penance, the proof of guilt, the badge of cooperation. But what began as a sacrament of healing and honesty was twisted into a tool of coercion. Under the weight of fear, pressure, and even torture, many confessions emerged not from the soul but from desperation. The Church taught that confession was a path to redemption. Those who confessed heresy might be spared death, offered penance, and returned to the fold. This promise gave the Inquisition its leverage. Confess, and you might live. Deny, and you risked execution. But the process wasn't always that simple. In many cases, confession was demanded before evidence had been presented. Interrogators sought admissions to justify punishments already decided. The confession became not a discovery of truth, but a performance of guilt. Torture was not used in every case, but its possibility hung over every interrogation. Physical suffering was one method: thumbscrews, the rack, sleep deprivation, but so was psychological pressure. Prisoners were isolated, lied to, and misled. They were told others had already confessed, or that their silence would doom their loved ones. These tactics often broke the strongest wills. People confessed to things they didn't understand, to beliefs they never held, simply to make the pain stop. Confessions were detailed and scripted. Interrogators often guided the process, supplying words, names, and motives. Scribes recorded everything, and even a nod or silence could be taken as confirmation. Once written, the confession was difficult to dispute. It became a permanent record, read aloud in public, and cited in future trials. Even if the accused recanted, the original document held more weight. Truth no longer mattered, the performance of guilt. Those who resisted confession were seen as obstinate, unrepentant, or even possessed. Their resistance was not interpreted as innocence, but as proof of deeper corruption. This logic made it nearly impossible to escape once accused. Confess, and you were guilty. Refuse, and you were even more dangerous. The trap was total. Yet not all confessions were forced. Some came from sincere belief people who, under pressure or remorse, truly came to think they had erred. These moments complicate the narrative. Not every penitent was a victim of abuse. Some were swept up in the emotional power of repentance, desperate for absolution. But even in these cases, the lines between free will and coercion blurred. The Inquisition's presence altered the meaning of every word spoken in its courts. Public confessions were often staged in churches or squares, where the accused wore symbolic garments, read apologies, and begged forgiveness. These events reinforced communal conformity. They turned private belief into public ritual, reminding everyone that faith was not only watched but enforced. Even the act of confessing became a tool of power. In the end, confession under the Inquisition was not about uncovering truth, it was about submission. It reduced complex beliefs, doubts, and hopes into simplified statements of error. And it reminded everyone that survival often meant saying what was demanded, not what was real. In the world of the Inquisition, punishment didn't end with confession. Even when a sentence stopped short of death, the aftermath was designed to leave a permanent mark. For many, the most lasting wounds were not on the body, but on identity. The Inquisition's symbolic punishments transformed human beings into walking warnings, visible reminders of what happened to those who dared to stray. Among the most recognizable tools of public penance was the San Benito, a penitential garment worn by the condemned. Made of coarse fabric and often decorated with painted flames, crosses, or the word heretic, it turned the body into a billboard of guilt. Those who wore it in public processions were meant to be pitied, feared, and ridiculed. In towns and villages, the image of someone in a San Benito seared itself into memory. Children whispered. Adults looked away or watched too closely. These garments were not returned after the ritual. In some cases, they were hung permanently in churches alongside the names of the penitent. A San Benito suspended in a chapel could remain for decades, ensuring that even after death, a person's shame endured. Families carried that burden. It was not just an individual condemned, it was a lineage. But garments weren't the only symbols used. The Inquisition imposed physical markers as well. Some people were branded, scarred, or forced to wear iron collars. Houses were marked with inquisitorial seals. Names were entered into public records with annotations that would forever associate them with heresy. These actions were more than punishment. They were erasure and isolation. The ritual of auto da fe, act of faith, was a central platform for displaying this symbolism. In these public spectacles, those accused would walk in processions, confess or be condemned, and receive their penance. The atmosphere was part theater, part terror. Clergy led chants, magistrates stood in judgment, and townspeople gathered in droves. These rituals blurred the line between religious ceremony and social enforcement. They made heresy not just a private sin, but a public stain. Shame, when institutionalized, becomes a system of control. The Inquisition understood this. It didn't just punish the body, it colonized reputation. It taught communities to participate in that punishment. Gossip became surveillance. Disdain became discipline. People learned that association with the accused event decades later could carry consequences. For those sentenced to wear these symbols, life after condemnation was a quiet agony. Employers turned them away. Neighbors grew distant. Marriages became harder to arrange. The taint followed them like smoke from a fire no one saw but everyone smelled. Even those who believed they had truly repented were rarely allowed to escape the stigma. In the eyes of the community, they had touched something unclean, and that touch lingered. And yet, some resisted even this. There are stories of people who wore the San Benito defiantly, who kept their posture straight in processions, who refused to let shame break them. A few fled, vanished, or built new lives in places where the symbols held no weight. But for most, the branding worked. They became cautionary tales. Their suffering became spectacle. Their silence, the Inquisition's lasting echo. Amid the fear, the punishments, and the relentless interrogations, one strategy often remained the only path to safety: silence. For countless individuals living under the Inquisition's shadow, the best way to survive was to say nothing, ask nothing, and reveal nothing. Silence became armor. And in many cases, it became a way of life. This silence wasn't just verbal. It extended into expression, behavior, and thought. People avoided eye contact during inquisitorial events. They kept their heads low in church, said prayers exactly as prescribed, and showed no reaction during public punishments. Emotions, too, were silenced. Anger was dangerous. Grief could be misread. Even joy, expressed at the wrong moment, might raise suspicion. Every gesture carried risk. Better to remain still. In homes, conversations grew guarded. Stories once shared by candlelight were set aside. Jokes disappeared. Questions about doctrine, miracles, or saints were silenced. Children learned quickly which topics were safe and which were deadly. Inquisitors listened not only to what people said, but to what they didn't. Hesitation, too long a pause, or a glance at the wrong moment could all be construed as guilt. Entire communities adopted this culture of silence. It wasn't just individuals protecting themselves, it was villages, towns, and families building invisible barriers around their thoughts. Public life became a carefully curated display of conformity. Private life became a quiet, sometimes joyless, retreat. This wasn't peace, it was the hush that follows fear. And yet, within this silence, subtle resistance lived. People found ways to communicate beneath the surface. A gesture, a look, a double meaning tucked into a sermon these were the whispers beneath the quiet. Some memorized prayers that weren't from church-approved books. Others passed down stories orally, ensuring they wouldn't be caught with written texts. These were the hidden threads of defiance, woven carefully into the fabric of daily life. The toll of constant silence was immense. People began to censor themselves not out of obedience, but out of reflex. They forgot what it meant to speak freely. Some lost touch with their own beliefs, unsure which thoughts were truly theirs and which had been implanted by fear. The Inquisition didn't need to be present in every town it had colonized the mind. Its presence was everywhere, precisely because it was nowhere. Some who broke the silence did so unintentionally. A slip of the tongue, a phrase remembered from a parent, a song hummed without thinking. These small breaches could unravel entire lives. The fear of speaking became generational. Parents taught children not just to be quiet, but to forget. In doing so, cultures began to disappear. Dialects faded, traditions dulled. Spiritual variety flattened into uniform dogma. And yet, silence was not always surrender. In many cases, it was the only resistance left. It was the choice to protect what remained: family, dignity, memory. It was a refusal to give the Inquisition what it demanded most: confession, submission, and spectacle. In the long shadow cast by its power, silence was often the last line of defense. Not everyone fled, and not everyone confessed. Across Europe, in cities and forests, mountains and basements, people who had been marked as heretics disappeared into the margins of society, hiding from inquisitors, surviving off rumors, and praying they would not be found. These were not only the defiant or rebellious. Many were ordinary believers, caught in theological traps, branded for beliefs they barely understood. Their decision to vanish was not cowardice. It was the only remaining act of autonomy in a world ruled by accusation. Some retreated into wilderness. In mountain villages or woodland shelters, isolated communities took root. There, belief could be practiced in secret, rituals preserved through whispered instruction. These groups, Cathars, Waldensians, and others, often moved under cover of darkness. They adopted signs, symbols, and secret routes. A friendly farmhouse might hold a hidden room. A shepherd might be a teacher of forbidden scripture. Faith became a matter of camouflage. In urban areas, hiding was more psychological. People changed names, burned books, altered accents. Conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, often lived with a dual identity. They attended Mass, but kept fragments of Jewish tradition alive behind closed doors. The fear of being discovered infected daily life. A wrong dish during a holiday, a missed church service, or the accidental mention of a forgotten phrase could invite a visit from the tribunal. The physical geography of Europe shaped these choices. Mountain ranges offered natural borders between danger and relative freedom. Border towns became waypoints for those fleeing inquisitorial zones. Entire networks formed informal, secretive, and deeply loyal. Families aided strangers. Monks, sympathetic to dissenters, gave shelter. Occasionally, even officials looked the other way. In these moments, humanity pushed back against doctrine. But hiding came with a cost. The isolation eroded trust. Parents hesitated to teach children sacred words for fear they might repeat them at the wrong time. Friendships became strained under the weight of secrecy. Marriages broke under the pressure of false identities. Even joy birthdays, weddings, prayers had to be muted, lest the wrong song or blessing give someone away. Survivors of inquisitorial escape carried lifelong trauma. They lived knowing their names might still appear on a list. Some were hunted for years, captured long after they had abandoned any rebellious activity. For the Inquisition, time did not heal. A person branded heretic once was a heretic forever until public penance or punishment was complete. Forgiveness was not freely given, it was earned through submission. And yet, the hidden kept their traditions alive. Their stories passed quietly from mouth to ear. Some wrote in code, disguising scripture as poetry or embedding doctrine into music. Others memorized texts line by line, ensuring survival beyond parchment. They lived in between fear and freedom, silence and speech, hope and resignation. The Inquisition, despite its reach, could not extinguish the human will to believe differently. Every person in hiding was a thread of resistance, a challenge to absolute control. They remind us that even in the darkest eras, truth and faith often find refuge not in temples or cathedrals, but in the quiet hearts of those who refuse to forget. Fear was never simply a byproduct of the Inquisition, it was a deliberate instrument. While the Church claimed to guide souls toward salvation, its methods often leaned on terror, not love. By making examples of the few, it disciplined the many. It taught obedience through pain, conformity through anxiety, and piety through the ever-present threat of punishment. Over time, this fear reshaped the very nature of faith itself. In the medieval world, religious belief was woven into daily life. It defined birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. But under the Inquisition, this rich spiritual fabric became brittle. Faith was no longer just a relationship with the divine, it became a performance of survival. Worship was shadowed by suspicion. Confession became surveillance. Sacred rituals were executed with mechanical precision, not because they brought peace, but because failure to perform them properly might draw attention. Communities were trained in fear. Children grew up watching public punishments and hearing sermons laced with warnings. They learned not just the words of prayer, but the proper tone, posture, and timing. Faith was memorized, not internalized. Belief was measured in gestures, crossing oneself at the right moment, bowing low enough, answering questions without hesitation. Fear crept into every sacred space. Clergy were not exempt. Priests tailored sermons to avoid controversy. Monks suppressed personal revelations. Bishops ensured their dioceses were free from suspicious activity. Religious leaders became guardians of conformity rather than shepherds of souls. The line between spiritual guidance and institutional enforcement blurred until the two were almost indistinguishable. Even private belief warped under this pressure. People who once prayed with joy began to do so with anxiety. Was their devotion enough? Had they committed error unknowingly? Could their dreams or doubts betray them? The soul became a battleground where certainty was replaced by vigilance, and the more fear dominated, the less room there was for genuine connection to the divine. This transformation had long-term consequences. Generations raised under fear developed spiritual habits rooted in guilt. They passed down caution, not curiosity. Wonder gave way to worry. Religious life, once a source of solace and meaning, became a minefield. Every step forward required a glance over the shoulder. And yet, not all faith was corrupted. Some found in the very act of survival a sacred purpose. They clung to belief not because it was safe, but because it still meant something. In whispered prayers and cautious rituals, people preserved what they could. For them, faith was not the absence of fear, but the endurance of hope in spite of it. The Inquisition failed to understand this resilience. It thought that by weaponizing fear, it could command faith. But true belief does not bloom under threat. It is not coerced. It is chosen, often quietly, sometimes painfully, always freely. By trying to dominate hearts through terror, the Inquisition betrayed the very spirit it claimed to protect. Behind the spectacle of punishment and the mechanics of torture were people executioners, jailers, interrogators tasked with carrying out the Inquisition's will. These individuals walked a narrow line between duty and damnation, faith and fear. Their role was hidden beneath layers of ritual, justification, and obedience. Yet for many, the emotional cost of what they did never disappeared. The burden they carried was not just physical, it was spiritual, psychological, and inescapably human. Executioners often came from backgrounds marked by marginalization. Many were former criminals, debtors, or individuals ostracized from polite society. Their occupation placed them at the fringes of the communities they served. They were necessary but not respected. Their touch was considered polluting. Even priests who absolved the condemned sometimes avoided direct contact with the one who swung the blade or lit the fire. And yet, the Inquisition relied on them. While inquisitors issued sentences, it was executioners who made them real. They manned the wheels, adjusted the ropes, and turned fire into doctrine. They understood the techniques that left bruises without breaking bones, or that pushed pain just far enough to induce confession without causing death, at least, not right away. Their knowledge was grim, but essential. What did this work do to them? Some hardened themselves, building a shield of ritual and routine. They saw their role as divine justice made manifest. Others dissociated, treating their tasks as mechanical necessity. A few took pride in their precision, believing themselves craftsmen of sacred punishment, but many perhaps most carried guilt. They heard the cries. They watched families collapse. They saw the light leave the eyes of those who had once begged for mercy, and they bore that memory in silence. In some cases, executioners attempted to compensate for their actions. They donated anonymously to churches. They cared for the children of those they'd punished. Some retired early, fleeing their work and disappearing into remote villages where no one knew their past. A handful even turned against the system, leaking information, writing anonymous accounts, or aiding those who tried to escape. Religious justification was the primary shield. Executioners were told they were instruments of God's justice. The rituals before and after an execution framed their actions in sacred terms. Masses were offered. Prayers were spoken. The condemned were asked to forgive. These gestures, though sincere, could not erase the deeper reality. One person was ending another's life in the name of purity. Jailers, too, bore their share of weight. They listened to endless pleas. They cleaned blood. They witnessed transformation, watching the hopeful become broken, the faithful lose faith, the guilty turned silent. Many jailers tried to remain impartial. Some treated prisoners with unexpected kindness. Others became numb, choosing detachment as a form of survival. But none escaped the stain entirely. The Inquisition did not allow these men to forget. Their names were recorded, their actions noted. They were part of a machinery that required their silence and compliance. If they questioned orders, they risked punishment themselves. If they faltered, someone else would take their place. The system was vast and indifferent. And so they bore their burden. Alone, invisible, necessary. They remind us that every act of institutional cruelty rests on human hands. And behind those hands are hearts that beat, tremble, and remember. even those who enforce terror do not walk away untouched. The executioners of the Inquisition, like its victims, were caught in a web of belief, duty, and fear, a web that no one escaped cleanly. The inquisitorial tribunal was not simply a courtroom, it was a performance. Every element, its structure, language, setting, and ceremony was crafted to convey the authority of the Church and to extract submission. Trials were less about evidence and more about affirmation that the accused was wrong and that the Church was always right. To attend a tribunal was to witness a pageant of power disguised as justice. The setting itself was intimidating. Often held in grand halls, cathedrals, or town centers, tribunals featured elevated benches, rich decorations, and solemn clerics robed in black. The accused sat below, often alone, surrounded by guards. The architecture reinforced hierarchy: heaven above, heresy below. The room whispered its judgment before a word was spoken. The language was Latin, foreign to most lay people. Only the inquisitors and a few clerks understood its exact meanings. Translations were sparse, paraphrased, or omitted entirely. This gap in understanding increased fear and confusion. The accused were strangers in their own trials, hearing only tones, not meanings. There were no defense attorneys, no open evidence, no witnesses called in support of the accused. Instead, anonymous denunciations were read aloud, with names often withheld for safety. The accused could not confront their accusers. In some cases, they didn't even know what they were accused of until after days of questioning. The tribunal was a game played by rules only one side understood. Public attendance was often encouraged. Townspeople were invited to observe, not to judge, but to internalize. What they saw reinforced obedience. If a neighbor, merchant, or local cleric could fall, anyone could. The message was clear: watch your beliefs, your words, your associations. The tribunal was a warning made visible. Confession was the ideal outcome. It confirmed the tribunal's righteousness and allowed for a merciful punishment. But the confession had to follow a narrative. If an accused person confessed in the wrong way, or at the wrong time, it could be rejected. Confession was not just admission, it was submission. Without it, the process grew harsher. The clerics who presided often believed they were saving souls. They prayed before trials, invoked God during sentences, and offered penance as a form of grace. But their rituals masked a deeper function: to crush dissent. The tribunal transformed spiritual inquiry into legal weaponry, reducing complex beliefs to a list of charges, reducing human stories to entries in a register. For the accused, the trial was often bewildering. Days blurred, questions circled, sleep was interrupted, meals were sparse. Some broke quickly, others resisted until they couldn't speak. A few remained silent until the end, a final act of defiance or resignation. But no one left unchanged. Even those released with penance carried scars invisible but lasting. The tribunal's true audience was never the accused. It was the community. Every judgment reinforced a structure of power. Every ritual reminded the faithful of what could happen if they strayed. The theater of the tribunal wasn't staged to find truth, it was staged to teach obedience. The Inquisition wasn't just an institution of spiritual discipline, it was also a machine that generated and redistributed wealth. Behind every confession and every public penance was a trail of economic consequence: property seized, fines levied, wealth transferred. For many, heresy was not only a theological error, it was a financial opportunity for those in power. When someone was accused of heresy, their property was placed under suspicion. If they confessed or were found guilty, it could be confiscated outright. Lands, livestock, jewelry, heirlooms, everything could be taken. These assets were then divided among the Church, the inquisitors, and sometimes secular authorities. In theory, the redistribution was justified as necessary for the Church's mission. In practice, it often created perverse incentives. Accusing a wealthy landowner meant a more profitable trial. Entire families could be ruined, their estates claimed and auctioned. In some cases, accusations were timed to coincide with disputes over inheritance or debt. Neighbors could denounce one another with an eye toward profit. Even within the clergy, rivalries were settled through whispered suspicion. The machinery of faith was greased by gold. Tribunals were costly to run: scribes, clerics, guards, food. Prisons and confiscated wealth helped fund the operation. But beyond logistics, the flow of goods became symbolic. Heresy was not just dangerous, it was expensive. Public punishment sent a dual message: deviate from doctrine and lose your soul and your silver. This system wasn't always direct theft, but rather cloaked in ritual and legitimacy. Fines were issued in the name of penance. Families were asked to pay for the upkeep of imprisoned relatives. Even those acquitted might face cost travel, lost income, damaged reputations. Heresy left financial ruin in its wake, whether or not guilt was ever proven. For many marginalized communities, especially converted Jews and Muslims, the economic threat was constant. Converso families who had worked for generations to achieve stability could lose everything overnight. Their success itself often drew attention. Wealthy converts were easy targets, conspicuous in their prosperity and vulnerable to envy. The line between spiritual concern and economic predation became razor thin. Some inquisitors resisted this corruption. They wrote against the misuse of power, tried to limit profiteering, and focused on genuine theology. But they were exceptions. The system rewarded results, and those results were measured in confessions, conversions, and coin. The more efficiently a tribunal processed cases, the more it earned. Speed meant savings, and fear guaranteed silence. Communities watched all this unfold. They saw what happened to the affluent merchant who suddenly vanished, the noble family whose lands were absorbed into church holdings. People began to self-police not only their beliefs but their wealth. Displays of prosperity were tempered. Donations to the church increased. Loyalty was expressed through tithes as much as through prayer. Economics and faith merged into a single system of control. And the church grew richer. Grand cathedrals, monastic expansions, gold-plated chaliceal bore, in part, the cost of someone else's fall. The faithful knelt before altars gilded by fear. The paradox was complete. To prove one's purity, one paid. To escape damnation, one surrendered wealth. The more dangerous heresy became, the more profitable orthodoxy was. The economics of the Inquisition remind us that power is rarely exercised for one reason alone. Doctrine may justify it, but gold sustains it. And behind every act of spiritual purification lies a ledger, quiet, cold, and brutally efficient. The Inquisition's brutality did not fall evenly. Women, already burdened by patriarchal structures in medieval society, faced a distinct and often harsher form of persecution. Their words were more easily doubted, their independence more easily condemned, and their suffering more often dismissed. When women became targets, they bore not just the weight of religious accusation, but the cumulative judgment of a world built to silence them. Women were frequently accused of heresy for behaviors that would have been considered ordinary in men. Speaking out, studying religious texts, offering spiritual counsel, or simply being unmarried and self-sufficient could draw suspicion. Female mystics, those who experienced visions or claimed divine connection, walked a razor's edge. Some were canonized, others were condemned. Midwives, healers, and herbalists were especially vulnerable. Their knowledge of the body, illness, and birth made them essential to their communities, but also mysterious and mistrusted. Inquisitors, uncomfortable with knowledge that did not pass through male ecclesiastical hands, often labeled such women as heretical or worse. Healing could be framed as sorcery. Herbal remedies became evidence of illicit spiritual power. Women who had converted particularly from Judaism or Islam were scrutinized with special suspicion. Their roles in maintaining household customs made them targets for cultural continuity. If children were taught the wrong prayer, or a candle was lit on the wrong night, blame often fell on the mother. The home itself became an extension of the tribunal, and women its first defendants. Marriage offered no protection. In fact, it sometimes brought more danger. Husbands could denounce wives. Confessions obtained from one partner could implicate the other. And since women had limited legal rights, their defense was weak. Their silence could be misread as guilt, their protest as rebellion. When imprisoned, women suffered unique torments. They were denied spiritual counsel, sometimes kept from their children, and subjected to humiliating interrogations that questioned not just their beliefs, but their chastity, purity, and roles as mothers. Torture, though, often euphemized in church records, left permanent scars. Even if released, a woman's reputation rarely recovered. Yet, despite these challenges, many women resisted. They crafted coded prayers. They passed forbidden books. Some joined clandestine religious circles, supporting one another in secret faith. Even in prison, women sang hymns, cared for fellow captives, and preserved traditions. Their resistance was quiet, but enduring. A few women stood boldly. They defended their visions, argued theology with inquisitors, and accepted death rather than deny their beliefs. These were rare and often erased from records. But echoes of their courage remain in trial documents, folk songs, and stories passed down through generations. The Inquisition treated women as threats because they could not be controlled in the same way as men. Their bodies carried life. Their words shaped households. Their silence, when enforced, dimmed the spirit of entire communities. To understand the Inquisition's cruelty fully, one must understand what it did to women, not just the pain it inflicted, but the voices it tried to erase. The Inquisition never punished a soul in isolation. When someone was branded a heretic, the consequences spilled into every corner of their household, most cruelly onto their children. A parent's trial often marked the beginning of a child's long journey into social exile, legal discrimination, and emotional trauma. Guilt became hereditary. Punishment echoed beyond the courtroom, imprinting itself on generations to come. Children were frequently present during arrests. They watched inquisitors enter homes with quiet fury books seized, family members dragged away, rooms overturned in search of forbidden relics. For many, the memory of that moment became their earliest understanding of fear. With one knock at the door, life transformed. A parent gone, a name stained, a future derailed. Orphaned or abandoned children of the condemned often became wards of the church or the state. In theory, they were rescued from heretical influence. In practice, they were often placed in institutions or fostered out to families who treated them as charity cases or worse. As reminders of shame, they were taught to renounce their parents' beliefs. Some were renamed. Others were forbidden from speaking of their families. They grew up in silence, carrying the invisible weight of a sentence they never earned. Those allowed to remain in their communities fared no better. Their family names became curses. Employers hesitated. Teachers passed them over. Friends withdrew. Young women from heretic families found it nearly impossible to marry. Boys were barred from guilds, ecclesiastical positions, or apprenticeships. In a world ruled by reputation, their bloodline was a stain that could not be washed clean. Even in death, the Inquisition's reach lingered. If a condemned person was executed, their children were often denied inheritance. Estates were seized. Family property was liquidated. What remained, if anything, was often claimed by the church. Some families spent years trying to restore their rights. Others gave up entirely, abandoning homes and histories to escape the shadow of condemnation. Despite this, some children held fast to memory. They kept scraps of letters, hidden symbols, whispered prayers. In rare cases, they preserved books or smuggled out personal items before confiscation. These small acts were more than sentiment, they were defiance. They insisted that their parents were more than their verdicts. A few even grew into resistance. Children of the condemned sometimes became chroniclers, quietly recording family stories that the church tried to erase. Others joined underground networks, helping fugitives or protecting banned texts. Their lives, though shaped by fear, became testimonies to survival. And through their actions, fragments of forbidden beliefs endured. But most lived in quiet sorrow. They learned not to ask questions, not to correct others, not to draw attention. In public, they rehearsed faith with mechanical precision. In private, they wondered what really happened and why. Many never knew the full truth. The records were hidden, the charges vague, the details lost. They were left with absence and suspicion. The children of the condemned remind us that institutional cruelty always leaves collateral damage. The Inquisition claimed to cleanse souls. But in doing so, it broke families, buried names, and planted seeds of generational trauma. Long after the fires died, the embers glowed quietly in the hearts of those left behind. The Inquisition may have sought to suppress voices, but the tremors it caused still ripple through the art and literature of Europe. In paint, parchment, and poetry, the legacy of terror was preserved not always openly, but in veiled symbols, coded language, and whispered stories. Artists and writers, often bound by the same fear as their neighbors, found clever, subversive ways to tell the truths the tribunals tried to silence. Some of the earliest reflections came in the form of marginalized, tiny illustrations scribbled in the borders of religious texts. Here, monks and scribes sometimes tucked away subtle depictions of punishment, cloaked figures, or weeping saints. These weren't always criticisms, but they hinted at a deeper unease, a tension between the church's declared mission and the reality unfolding behind cloistered walls. Later, during the Renaissance, more overt commentary began to appear. Satirical poems, allegorical plays, and philosophical dialogues emerged texts that criticized blind dogma and interrogated the ethics of authority. These works often didn't name the Inquisition directly, but their themes were unmistakable: fear used as faith, violence justified by virtue, truth buried beneath ritual. In these lines, readers found both catharsis and warning. Visual artists employed similar strategies. A painting might show a scene of martyrdom not from the Inquisition, but from early Christianity, inviting comparisons without inviting punishment. Others used color and light to contrast purity and corruption, depicting religious figures with hidden symbols of guilt, cracked halos, reversed texts, or crumbling altars. These subtle cues allowed viewers to read between the brushstrokes. In regions where the Inquisition's grip was looser, such as parts of the Netherlands or later Protestant territories, more explicit critiques emerged. Writers chronicled the cruelty of inquisitors, often portraying them as hypocrites or zealots. Plays mocked the absurdity of trials, while pamphlets recounted personal testimonies. These works reached wide audiences and fueled growing skepticism of unchecked religious power. Even architecture bore witness. Inquisitorial prisons were often designed for intimidation: narrow halls, dark cells, and twisted staircases. Artists who later sketched or painted these places did so with grim detail, turning cold stone into moral commentary. To walk such halls was to feel the weight of silence, to see justice bent into submission. Survivors and descendants, too, contributed their voices. Family legends, folk tales, and regional ballads sometimes held encoded references to trials, disappearances, or forbidden prayers. These oral traditions kept memories alive even when written records were destroyed. They ensured that pain would not be forgotten, and that resistance, however quiet, would be remembered. Ironically, the Inquisition's attempt to erase dissent preserved it. By driving artists underground and writers into allegory, it forced creativity to evolve. Truth found refuge in metaphor. Outrage took root in irony. and over centuries, the very tools used to enforce silence became vessels for remembrance. Art and literature cannot undo the suffering of the past, but they serve as testimony proof that even under oppression, the human spirit persists, that beauty can be born from brutality, that in the flicker of a brushstroke or the curve of a stanza, a voice once silenced may still speak. Though most of its infamy lies within the borders of medieval Europe, the reach of the Inquisition eventually extended far beyond. As European empires expanded into the New World, they brought with them not only armies and missionaries, but also the institutions of control, including inquisitorial power. In this colonial context, the Inquisition adapted to new landscapes, languages, and victims, becoming not just a religious tribunal, but a tool of empire. In places like Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines, inquisitorial offices were established to regulate the spiritual life of colonists and converted indigenous populations. These new tribunals mirrored their European counterparts, complete with secret denunciations, public punishments, and ritualized trials. But the victims now often came from cultures unfamiliar with Christian doctrine, who had been forcefully converted, and who still maintained traces of ancestral belief in private. The Inquisition interpreted this syncretism not as cultural survival, but as dangerous heresy. Native peoples were subjected to intense scrutiny. Practices that had spiritual meaning for centuries were recast as idolatry. Traditional dances, songs, healing rituals, and even language were sometimes suppressed or reframed as signs of witchcraft. Elders and spiritual leaders were particularly targeted, accused of leading people astray and undermining the authority of the Church. These accusations were sometimes sincere, but often served as justification for eroding indigenous autonomy. The Inquisition also policed the behavior of settlers. Colonial life created a distance from Rome, both geographically and spiritually. In frontier towns, priests worried about lax discipline, drunkenness, sexual misconduct, and unauthorized preaching. The Inquisition became a mechanism to reinforce orthodoxy in these far-flung communities, an instrument of spiritual order in lands viewed by European elites as morally wild and corruptible. And then there were the conversos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity who had traveled or been brought to colonial lands. They were already under suspicion in Europe, and that shadow followed them across the ocean. In some colonies, they formed tight-knit communities, trying to live quietly and avoid attention. But the Inquisition pursued them, often with a fervor matched only by its European counterpart. Trials for Judaizing, secretly practicing Jewish customs, were common in the Americas, sometimes resulting in torture and death. Even in places thousands of miles from the original tribunals, fear traveled well. What's most chilling is how efficiently the system replicated itself. It didn't matter whether one was in Seville or Lima, Lisbon or Manilith, architecture of accusation was the same. The process, the rituals, the records, the punishments all traveled with the empire. Paperwork was shipped across oceans, orders were issued in Latin, punishments were public, and power was absolute. But just like in Europe, resistance survived. Some indigenous communities went underground, preserving traditions in secret or blending them subtly with Christian rites. Folk festivals became coded rituals. Sacred sites were rededicated with new names but retained old meanings. Songs were reworded. Symbols were hidden in embroidery, carving, and architecture. Even in forced conversion, the spirit of belief endured. The Inquisition's global expansion teaches us that persecution was never limited by geography. It was a strategy, a method of asserting power over culture, belief, and identity. And in the colonial world, it operated as both religious and imperial force. Wherever it landed, it didn't just target heresy, it shaped what civilization itself would mean. As Europe transitioned into the early modern period, the grip of the Inquisition began to loosen, but it did not vanish quietly. Its final centuries were not marked by enlightenment or reform, but by inertia, bureaucracy, and occasional flickers of the same cruelty that had defined its height, the last trials did not erupt in fire. They whispered in ink, lingered in dusty halls, and faded in the slow march of history. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the world was changing. Scientific inquiry, philosophical exploration, and growing political unrest began to challenge the absolute authority of the Church. New ideas, some of which would birth revolutions, were circulating in universities, coffee houses, and underground print shops. Against this backdrop, the Inquisition often appeared outdated, clumsy, and increasingly out of step with the times, but it remained dangerous. Trials still occurred. People continued to be accused of sorcery, blasphemy, and heterodox reading. Books were banned. Galileo's infamous encounter with the Roman Inquisition, forced to recant his heliocentric theory, was a stark reminder that the institution still wielded cultural power. But increasingly, the fire was metaphorical. Heretics were silenced more often with exile, censorship, and social ruin than with flames. Records from this era reveal the growing discomfort within the institution itself. Some inquisitors hesitated, others questioned the process, but few dismantled it. Like a great machine rusting from within, the Inquisition continued to turn slowly, unevenly, but still grinding forward. The last official executions were carried out in the late 1700s. In Spain, a schoolteacher was garroted and burned for alleged heretical speech in 1826, a tragic final echo of centuries past. Even as constitutions were being written and industrialization took root, the shadow of medieval judgment still reached forward. Eventually, political forces, not spiritual reform, brought the institution down. The rise of liberal governments, the collapse of monarchies, and the secularization of civil law stripped the Inquisition of its teeth. In Spain, it was abolished and revived several times before being formally dismantled in 1834. In Portugal and Italy, similar declines unfolded. The archives were closed, the offices emptied. The long silence of buried documents began. But legacy does not vanish with abolition. In some corners, the methods of the Inquisition, the emphasis on confession, the policing of thought, the use of fear to maintain unity, migrated into other institutions. Totalitarian states, ideological regimes, and even modern movements have drawn from this dark heritage, proving that systems of control often outlive the structures that created them. The last trials remind us that cruelty rarely stops all at once. It slows, stumbles, disguises itself, and finally recedes, but the memory lingers. The names of the last victims are still written, their fates recorded in ink that has not yet faded. They stand at the end of a long and brutal line, bearing witness to the truth that belief, when corrupted by power, can become a weapon even in its dying breath. As the Inquisition faded from public life, something peculiar began to happen. People forgot, or more precisely, they chose to forget. Over generations, the memory of tribunals, of burnings, of whispered accusations and broken families softened into distant myth or vanished altogether. This forgetting was not accidental. It was encouraged by church leaders, by secular authorities, even by those whose ancestors had once suffered. It was easier to bury the past than to reckon with it. In textbooks, the Inquisition was reduced to a few paragraphs, terms like religious court or heresy trials, used to sterilize centuries of fear. Official records, though vast, were often locked away in archives or scattered across dioceses. Survivors' stories were rarely passed down. And in places where the Inquisition's grip had once been strongest, shame sealed many mouths shut. Silence became protection. For clergy, it preserved the moral authority of the Church. For nations, it avoided reopening wounds of complicity. For families, it spared future generations the weight of ancestral trauma. But silence is a double-edged sword. What is unspoken cannot be healed. What is forgotten may be repeated. Historical amnesia dulled public awareness of how deep the Inquisition's reach truly was. Most remember the grand images, the stakes, the robes, the gavel-like power of inquisitors. Fewer recall the day-to-day cruelty, a child losing a parent, a widow fined into poverty, a midwife accused for using herbs. These stories matter. They are where truth lives not in spectacle, but in consequence. Modern institutions sometimes echoed inquisitorial practices, unconsciously or otherwise: the policing of belief, the use of confession under duress, the suppression of dissent through moral panic. Systems of power have always studied the past, whether to avoid its mistakes or to replicate its tools. When the history of the Inquisition is reduced to caricature, its more subtle dangers go unnoticed. Yet, there are signs of awakening. In recent decades, historians have published long-buried trial transcripts. Museums and documentaries have offered the public access to once-hidden records. Scholars and theologians alike have begun to ask, what does this legacy mean today? How can institutions that once punished difference now protect it? Can belief evolve without again becoming a weapon? Acknowledging the past does not weaken faith. It strengthens it. To understand the failures of the Inquisition is to understand the cost of moral certainty left unchecked. It is to see how good intentions, when married to unchecked authority, can lead to systems of devastating harm. The Inquisition didn't end because people suddenly became kinder. It ended because the world around it changed, and because a few brave voices refused to stay silent. It is their courage that history must remember. Not the robes nor the flames, but the refusal to forget. The story of the Inquisition is not simply a tale of medieval cruelty. It is a mirror showing us what happens when institutions fear difference more than they value dignity. What begins as a pursuit of purity can become a spiral of suspicion, punishment, and loss. And though the fires have died and the dungeons stand empty, the questions the Inquisition left behind still burn. What is justice without mercy? What is faith without freedom? What becomes of a society that demands conformity at the expense of compassion? In the end, the Inquisition failed not in its immediate goals, perhaps, but in its lasting purpose. It did not preserve unity. It shattered trust. It drove belief underground. It turned communities against themselves, and in its zeal to save souls, it scarred them instead. Yet, even within that darkness, there were flickers of humanity: prisoners who refused to betray others, judges who hesitated, families who risked everything to shield the accused, artists who painted truth in code, scholars who smuggled forbidden books, survivors who remembered. These people did not defeat the Inquisition, but they outlasted it. Their legacy is not in ruins, but in resilience. Memory is our final resistance. When we choose to remember, fully and honestly, we take away the Inquisition's last weapon, silence. We replace fear with understanding. We rebuild what terror tried to break, and in doing so, we honor the countless lives bent beneath the weight of dogma. This story matters because it is not over. Wherever authority goes unquestioned, wherever truth is dictated rather than discovered, wherever belief is punished instead of explored, the Inquisition lives on in different names, different robes, different tools, but the same fear. We must name it, we must study it, and we must vow not to become it. The dark side of the medieval Inquisition is not just about the past. It is a warning, a call to vigilance, and above all, a plea for empathy.